Lullaby for sure.
Good morning, Sarah. Good morning, Amanda.
Good morning. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. Were they getting coffees?
Yeah, they're at Starbucks.
They're at Starbucks. It has been the favorite place, Judy. I have to tell you that the guy at Starbucks has really liked the guys coming to see them.
It's probably the only business he gets all day.
I asked him that, and he said, no, he said, we've had a
Little other.
a little other.
They should give us a discount.
They should give us a discount.
I should ask him about that then.
But I did check.
My daughter's car is
I did check the price to see if we wanted to cancel it and go back to the crabs, you know. And you're right, we're spending less money there than we are on the crabs, so we're doing good. Yeah, believe it or not.
I believe it.
Anyway, good morning. Sarah and Karen are coming, but I don't want to take their time, so I'm going to get you started just by saying good morning. Did you enjoy the library last night?
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. And did our group enjoy their burgers and shakes last night?
Yeah.
So were you in Columbus or Dayton?
Dayton. We went to Dayton.
Dayton.
Yeah, we went back and we did the shopping thing last night, and we did burgers and fries, or burgers, fries, and
Milkshake.
Milkshake. Yeah. So we did our real American eating. It was a lot of fun. Well, anyway, we do want you to have fun, and as well as we want you to really work hard. But I'm going to go back, and I'm going to go back to the work hard piece again. If you notice over here, we have little check marks by some of you, and not check marks by other. So I essentially still need the plan for the first strategy you've had. I need it from Russia, Romania, and Sean, you're kind of off the hook on that one, but you're not off the hook on this one. Okay, so, but then for the second part, we're looking at the competency-based training training system. I need for those, if you don't have a check mark here, I need your plan here as well. And it doesn't have to be real complicated, just something that we can look at. This is where we started. This is our thinking process of the strategies that we see are important. And I want to get those on a document for you. Okay, this morning, I'm really excited that we're going to really be drilling down and looking at kinship, foster care, and adoption. And specifically looking at all that this team has prepared and recognizing that up until now you've had a lot of information. The feedback, Judy, has been absolutely bring it on. We want more, we want more, we want deeper, continue it coming. And that's what we've heard from the group as I've questioned them. Good. So I'm pleased to hear that. I'm also pleased that we are hearing from you, and the dialogue from you has been so rich. It was extremely rich yesterday afternoon. And I want to encourage you to do more of that. Please, where we are today, because of your comfort level of being able to speak out and really ask those hard questions, challenge this group. Because this is the heart of what we do. If we look at your involvement with World Without Orphans, et cetera, looking at what you're doing already in your systems, this is the heart. This is the real stuff to get kids and families, and to make sure that we have families that are prepared and that we've got kids that can remain in those families. We don't want to see disruption. We don't want to see quick decisions. We want to be thorough. So please drill down and ask these ladies. They're the experts. They come to you with expertise. Let's pull that expertise out, okay? I'm going to turn over to Kelly. She is the leader of the crew. And let's just say thank you, Kelly, for being here. All right.
So we don't set you guys up. We've told everybody that we don't know it all.
Oh, thank you. No, I told them that they know everything.
I know that's why I'm saying this.
If you think I know everything, you'll soon find out.
I said they're the experts and they know it all, so we're prepared.
So I know we met all of you on Monday, but you didn't get to meet Amanda. She was one that we were trying to Skype in, didn't quite work on the computer. But just again, I am Kelly Gruber. I've been with the Institute for Human Services for about 13 years. I'm the manager of the foster care, adoption, and kinship care training area of IHS.
I'm Sarah Tornicio. Again, I'm with IHS for, it'll be 3 years tomorrow, actually. So, yeah, thank you. And I am the kinship arm of the FAK group, so trying to stay on top of everything that's kind of happening with kinship. So that's where I'm at.
I'm Amanda Schreinghammer, and I started with IHS in August. But prior to that, I worked in adoption, so my focus at IHS is the adoption.
So we welcome you. We also, as Judy said, we don't know everything, and we know that you guys know things that we don't know. So we really want this to be, which is why we're sitting here at the table with you and not standing up in more of a presentation style, because we want to be at the table with you. We want to hear what you know, because we want to learn from you too. And we also want to be able to have an open dialogue. So we have topics, we have things that we've identified that we think are important, but we also we want this to be a conversation. We don't want to be just up here, the three of us talking with you listening. So we want you to feel free to interrupt at any time and ask questions. We may be asking you all some questions. Since it's a small group, we aren't probably going to break up and do any small group exercises because we're already a small group, but we would like to keep this more of an informal conversation. So we're going to probably go till about another hour or so, about 10:45 or so, and then take a short break so you can stretch, and then we'll continue the conversation through 1 o'clock when you have your lunch. So we're here all day. I'm going to tell you too, there's nuts in front of you. If you don't have a bag, I think I got a random bag. So it's pecans. They're pecan. Oh, you didn't get your bag. Okay.
Except me.
There should be an extra bag somewhere. Lana has it. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Per person, yes. There's a one per person, exactly. And just so that you know what's on there, they're pecans, and they've got butter on them, and egg whites, and sugar. So they're very sweet. But I wanted to tell you what's in there in case anybody has any dairy or egg or nut allergies.
Oh, he has allergies. You'll pull it over.
Allergies. Do you have allergies?
That's great.
So we just wanted to welcome. We had our statewide holiday celebration yesterday. I made these nuts for that, so I put some back for you guys.
That's nice.
Nice.
Yeah. So enjoy. So today we have. I don't know if everybody can see that, but this is our agenda for the day, and I will stand up for that.
I think it's just a party for Christmas.
We wanted to start talking about why we're training and seeing training as systems change agent. And I think you guys have talked already a little bit about that.
Yes.
Okay, so just kind of briefly talking about that. We want to talk about, we sort of did the newspaper, if you who, what, when, where, why, how. So the next question is who needs training? So we're going to talk a little bit about who are all the different populations that you could train, and what are some things to think about in terms of whether you train them or not, and how do their training needs differ. We're going to get to that today, hopefully. And then what kind of training do we need? What kind of training do they need? And I think that's probably going to be the meat of the conversation today, where we're going to really get into some of the overarching principles, thoughts that we need everyone to understand and to buy into. And then we can also break it down in terms of who needs what based on the tasks that they're doing. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how do we train. And I think you might have also covered this as well, but specifically for kinship, foster care, adoption workers, and resource families, what are some things that we need to think about in terms of how we train them? And then if we get to it, we wanted to give some time to just some of the logistical and practical considerations when you're running a training center. And you may have gotten to those already, but there are just some real basic things to think about in terms of capacity and what you're going to be capable of doing, just kind of the day-to-day tasks of running a training center. So we wanted to, if we have time, we wanted to talk about that as well. So we also, this is kind of our best guess, really, about what we thought you might need based on what we knew about you and what we heard on Monday. But we we heard there were some questions that have come up through the week, and people were like, well, ask Kelly and Sarah and Amanda that. So we want to know what are some of those questions? What are some of those questions that have come up earlier in the week that you really wanted to make sure that we talk about today? So I think there was someone, I'm just going to start us out. I think there was somebody that had a question, it might have been you, Sarah, about developmental disabilities. Okay, so we'll touch on that and when that comes into play.
Yeah, you mean if there's different training for families who are going to adopt, foster, or kinship, different profiles of kids, right?
Mhm, right.
Older kids, kids with health issues and so on.
Right. We'll talk about that. What other questions, what other pieces of information do you want us to make sure we address today?
Okay, I have another question.
Yes, good. We're happy.
Excellent.
Questions are good.
The first time that I came to America, I was at a Foolish Alliance for Summit, and there were several testimonies of kids who had been into many foster families. And I was surprised with that. Actually, I was shocked. So I would like you to talk a little bit about what happens that they've been to 8, 10, 15, 20 foster families. Okay, so why that's so harming, and what we can do or what we must do.
Yes.
Because we're just starting on this path.
Yes, yeah. What you can learn from our mistakes.
Yeah, that's
to
right.
do it better.
That's what we want.
What other topics do you hope that we cover today?
Your name was, sorry, your name was mentioned at least twice a day, each day. Besides Monday, when you told, everybody yourself that you're trauma awareness.
I don't think I use the term trauma queen, but yes.
That's gonna be your new name.
Yes. So you want to hear? Yeah, yes, I will
think
always
everybody
talk
will
about trauma. So
Trauma.
yes, trauma training, definitely.
I think that fits into what my question would be is, how would you manage developmental delays at different ages? It seems to be obviously priority for the child and mitigate those issues, I suppose.
Okay. I think does that fit with developmental disabilities in this discussion, or do you think that's separate?
I think it's maybe a little bit separate in the sense that you won't necessarily diagnose a child with depression. Instead, you just say that they have behavioral issues, perhaps. Maybe
So-
with the brain and things like that.
So we're talking about maybe some of the impact of trauma and how that impacts
Yeah.
development, mental
yeah,
health.
so yeah, okay, that's what, sorry, thanks for phrasing.
Okay. How we manage that.
I mean, with different ages and putting them together, and that's a bit of a mushy area.
Yeah, it's still, I'm gonna say, it's still a bit of a mushy area. When we know a whole lot now, we didn't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, we weren't even using the term trauma, But we know now so much about how trauma impacts the brain and what trauma does. Where we're still in our infancy is, okay, how do we manage that? How do we, so I can tell you a little bit about what we know, but it's very limited compared to what we know about the impact of trauma. That seems to be where people are pulling. I could talk for 10 minutes right now, so I'm gonna stop, but we'll get to that.
There's another question that I have. Maybe you're going to talk about that. I know that it's all a process, and nowadays you have like a model of training for each one of these kind of families, right? I would like to know how it was in the beginning, how it is now. What is the model that you got nowadays about long hours of? I mean, how many hours of training do you use? What needs to be covered? Probably you're going to talk about that. I just want to make sure.
So what is the Ohio model of training look like? Yeah, when we were putting this presentation together, we were thinking about, okay, what do we do in Ohio, and what does the ideal practice look like? And
aren't always doing the ideal. So we'll talk a little bit about what Ohio is doing, but we really want to focus on, you know, what do we think is best practice?
Okay.
And there are some, you know, some factors that impact us and how we can practice in Ohio. So we'd like to focus on what is best practice, but we can talk about what the Ohio is and maybe talk about where we see some of the shortcomings.
I think part of our question is to give some historical background.
History. Mm-hmm.
What were you doing at the beginning?
From the very beginning. Yeah. We can talk about that. In terms of what IHS has been doing with pre-service training or foster parent training, we've really just been in charge of that as a statewide system, I think since the late 90s. So fairly recently, and before that, it was very piecemeal. It was happening kind of here and there. So it hasn't been a model, a standard of practice for really that long. If you think about it, but we can talk a little bit about the history.
That just fit in with what it looked like.
Yeah, we put
History.
history, so I remember history. Yeah, so that we remember history. I'm relying on them to also help me remember everything. Anything else? And we can always add as we go. Just wanted to make sure that we meet your needs. So,
Can I suggest one thing?
sure.
Because we had some conversation about this, the common assessment process and the view of families as being potentially adoptive, foster, respite, kinship, any of, because there's some bifurcation in some of these systems that foster parents cannot adopt and whatever. So how we evolved from that into where we are now.
Yeah, and we still separate out our kinship caregivers. That's a whole another conversation, but yeah. So assessment. So it's not necessarily one assessment for all families. There is a separate kin assessment, but that we'll talk about that. What that means. Caregiving. Yeah, it's all caregiving and adoption. Yeah. Just put and adoption. So the reason I'm having Sarah separate out caregiving from adoptive parent is because that helps us remember the permanency piece. Because a caregiver, whether they're kin or they're foster, is a temporary caregiver. And sometimes we'll say foster parent, sometimes our own laws and rules say foster parent, but just making that distinction. And I think you guys might use the term carer, foster carer. But it makes the distinction that is a temporary position or role, as opposed to an adoptive parent where there is that permanency piece, and they are the child's parent. So that's why I want to try to separate that out. Anything else? So we wanted to start this off with talking about the why we train and seeing training and talking about training as a systems change agent in terms of foster care, adoption, and kinship care, and where we want people to go. So we just came up with, we were just thinking on our own about what are some of the phrases, what are some of the philosophical statements that we thought were important, that if everybody from the staff that you're training to the resource families, even if you're training, to the primary parents, the community, if you can get that system to embrace some of these philosophies, then you can move forward in system change. That's the goal. And we're not there yet with all of these, but this is where we're headed to, where we're trying to influence system change. And so some of these you may have heard, and some of these might be new to you, but I'm just going to talk. You guys can join in too. So one of the things that we want to make sure that all of our foster parents, all of our staff know, everyone that's involved gets, if we want to push for system change, is the importance of the child's history and the importance of their identity, so that we don't lose that. In pre-service, when we do our pre-service training for our foster parents, we have this activity where we take this plant and we have it in a pot, and we bring this new pot out, and we bring new dirt out, and we pull this plant out and we start with the plant, we're talking and we start cutting off the roots of the plant. And we talk about how, oh, this pot is so much prettier. This is new dirt. Look how great this is. It's a prettier pot. It's a newer dirt. And we put this rootless plant into this new pretty pot with this new great dirt. And what do you guys think happens to the plant?
It dies.
It dies.
It dies, right? So it's a quick way to get the point across of the history and the identity and how important that is, and that you can't, just because you're moving a child into what we perceive as a better environment, if we don't bring those roots with them, if we don't let that child bring their history, bring their roots, it's probably it's going to be a struggle. It's not going to work because those roots are what helps that child survive. It's what helps that child form their identity. They figure out who they are, particularly in adolescence. I know somebody was talking about working with adolescents, but how they figure out who they are as an adolescent is partially based on where they come from, who they are, or who they were, who their family is, what their community looks like. And if they don't have that information, then it's a struggle to form an identity. So that's one of the pieces that we want families and caregivers and staff to know. So is that a new concept? Is that what do you guys think? No? It's something, okay. So feel free to add your own conversation or your own input, feedback to this. So we talked about trauma, so minimizing trauma. One way to minimize trauma is to keep the history, keep those roots, help that child be grounded in their new environment by maintaining those connections. So we have a whole pre-service module on minimizing the trauma placement, and that's something that we have that's new that we didn't used to have a few years ago. But we recognized we have I guess in child welfare we identify placement as a trauma, and that is a hard, I think, concept for families to accept. Because a lot of our families that are coming in are kind of seeing themselves as the rescuers, the people that are bringing hope. They're not seeing themselves as people who are creating trauma for a child. So we really talk about anytime you move a child, anytime you put a child in a new environment, that is a traumatic experience for that child. And so we need to acknowledge that, and then we need to talk about what is it that we can do to minimize that trauma. What are some things that we can do? But we first have to acknowledge that it is trauma. And I see heads shaking. So this is something, okay, you guys feel free to debate or argue if you don't agree with it. Yeah, go ahead.
This is related to the first one, I think. My question would be, to what extent should people know about the history of the child? Which parties involved
That's such a great question.
should know? I think it could become a bit of a I tag you and, kind of more stigmatized.
Labeling.
Instead, yeah. So
Yeah.
just that balance, I guess, of being informed versus being, tagged and bagged.
Right. We used to have that that philosophy of let's put them in the foster home or let's put them in the adoptive placement and not tell the family anything because we don't want the family to label. Let's just let them get to know. But the difficulty with that, the struggle with that is if you don't know what that child has been through, you don't know what those child's triggers are, you don't know the best way to respond to that child. And you can, definitely cause more trauma because you don't know how to interact with that child because you haven't got that information. So now we train that it's very important to get the history from the very beginning, and that we're always working with our workers to say, to make sure they get. Sometimes they want to hold on to information because they think, well, the foster parent shouldn't have this. This is confidential information. And our point is, this child is in this home, and so anything that's going to help this.
There's necessary information to make that an ethical decision about.
Right,
the best interest of
exactly.
the child, sure.
Exactly, and we can go more in depth about interacting with triggers and kids with trauma. But we just wanted to talk a little bit about the philosophy in terms of system change. So,
We do have a problem in Brazil that many times the professionals, they take too long to protect the kid, the child, right? So to do the placement and so on. Do you have the same kind of problems in some places here in the States? How do you cope with that?
So I guess I'm not quite sure what you
They
mean.
are keeping them too long in the biological family, is the whole,
Oh,
that the
prior
family
to-
preservation is working.
Yes.
Is it what you mean? Sorry.
Yeah, and even to place them in a foster family or in a residential care program, you know, and the kids are exposed to harm situations for too long.
Yeah, I would say that our system is just now kind of recognizing that and doing something about that in terms of our funding. Because we're limited, and this is nationally, our country is limited in doing a lot of that prevention work or interacting at an earlier state because there's just not the funds. Our funds kind of get triggered when that child goes into placement or when we open that case, which is, as you said, that's later on when there's so much happening that it's not safe for them to be in a home. They've been abused, they've been neglected, they've experienced other trauma. We've recently passed some federal legislation that acknowledges that, and it's going to allow us to use our funding sooner and not wait until the kids get into care. So I'm hoping that will change a little bit. I don't,
But are you, well, and I was gonna add, I think maybe we're a little bit on the flip side where we react too quickly sometimes and we don't put services in that could preserve the family. So because our funding comes when the child is placed. So it's, for the agencies, it makes more sense. They can help the families more or the child, at least if they're in placement. So sometimes we remove too quickly rather than leaving them too long. So then, we need a middle ground there. And hopefully with some of this new legislation that will help that flow into care be stymied a little bit, but still helping actually the primary families and the child, having it be family focused and child centered. So that's it. Anyway, but yeah,
If I can link us back to an earlier discussion, that's the purpose of your risk and safety assessment technology. Because you don't pull a child because it's traumatic unless the risk is high enough. So if you do that really well, funding aside, you ought to be able to make a decision about when a child must come out of a family to be safe. But your point is really well taken. If you don't have the funds and the services to keep the child in the family and support the family, those are protective capacities. If you can put those in, the risk comes down and you don't have to move the child. So think it in that same paradigm, because that's the paradigm that's going to help you sort through all these dilemmas.
If I just may add that in many instances, the issue is that social services are not present in the family's life who are not seemingly at risk. And that is why also we were talking about the role of the integrated trainings for all the professionals who might be in contact with the family. GPs, so the family doctors or health visitors or community nurses or teachers or kindergarten teachers who can refer the children in case of a potential risk to the social services, because obviously if they are not visible, how would they know that there is a need for an assessment? So that is why in many countries now, part of the child protection legislation is this mandatory reporting, not only in severe child abuse cases, but a referral to the child welfare agency so that they can pay more attention on the family at risk. And I guess this is a kind of protective factor also if the other professionals are aware of the signs of risk, so that they know that they should be suspicious in some instances. If the kids are hungry when they come to school, or they are very tired, they can pay attention. It's a very small sign, seemingly small sign, then can be, but how would the social services know about it? Because they can't really detect everybody in the community, and they shouldn't.
And I think with that, within our system, people are a little leery of calling child welfare because of the stigma that we've removed quickly. So they may see something and they're like, I think they need help, but they're a little bit leery of calling child welfare because they don't want to see the child removed. And that's what kind of the perception is. They think that we just come in and instantly remove the child. So hopefully that, again, with new legislation and policies, that will go backwards. So
I would like to add just to kind of anchor a bit. Many of the countries that we're really looking at here, the developing countries, the social services, the child protection agencies are far from anything that we would see here in North America. And more often, what we see is a police state. We see that if there's a child that is brought or needs a care that may be through the police or through a family member that just sees a child in the street. And it goes back to Kelly, and I think it would be really important to address this throughout, is that the importance of history and identity for the child is compromised because of that. That more of the children that we would be working with in these developing countries would be kids that would maybe picked up off the street that would just suddenly show up, then there would be no history and identity, where the child came from, or whatever. So gathering that information has been something new that really requires being rather creative to do that. And then looking at in terms of even understanding the child protective systems, we really do not have the sophistication in a lot of the countries, or there aren't the sophistication to actually even help them to see, we want to work with them in any way. So it's just like we get what we get, and it's usually kids off the street or through the police.
Like, actually, have you heard, is there any model that try, like, instead of just having this private space and then the government agencies, like other community, like churches or intervening just to fill this gap? Do you have any experience, or for instance, that your training center involved in building the capacity of such organizations to bridge this gap?
Yeah, well, I should say many of our private agencies probably started from a religious base.
Okay.
They haven't maintained that, but they started from churches or from organizations. So we do have that background. But one of the things that might answer your question is I was thinking about when we were talking about trauma, and you mentioned pediatricians. So there is an effort, I think, now to pull in different systems, the educational system, the mental health system, the physical health system, and have them watching and looking for this so that we intervene sooner, and also because of the stigma of child welfare, so that we can get services in. But we are limited, and I'm just talking about our training center because of funding. We are limited to working with, and that's one of the things we would talk about, our capacity. There's a lot of stuff that we could do. There's a lot of places where we can intervene, right? There's a lot of problems and issues out there. And if we try and do everything, we're not going to be able to do anything well. So we really have to focus. And so our focus is working with the child welfare system. But there are, one of the things that I see as a movement that is, I think, pretty exciting is I know that you guys are aware of the ACEs study.
Oh, yeah.
So, there's like that 10-question questionnaire that's very simple. There is definitely a movement here in the States to look at trauma as a public health issue, so that we're doing primary intervention or prevention. And so there's a movement to get pediatricians to screen as part of their regular screening, because most children will go to a pediatrician at some point and get a physical, ideally at once a year, but that doesn't happen. But at some point they will, or if they get injured and they have to go to the doctor or sick. So if we can get our pediatricians to be doing that trauma screening as a regular piece of their examination of any child that comes into their office, then that is a very good point for them to be able to start intervening. I guess it isn't really primary prevention, because if they screen and they have trauma, they've already experienced trauma. So let me back that up. But it's an earlier intervention than it would be to wait till Children's Services gets involved. And just by asking some of those questions and educating the family, so maybe that child hasn't experienced trauma, or maybe that child is in a community violence situation, and that parent has the capacity and the ability to move to a different location once they understand that that's traumatizing to the child. So, okay. So we're going to talk a lot about trauma. I can talk about trauma all day. This is another piece. Love is not enough, and I think you said this or something like this, Sarah. Did I get up, Sarah? Yeah. On Monday, but just we do have our families coming in. You guys have volunteers as your workforce, and just so excited, want to help, want to do the right thing for kids, but that's not enough. And we have to train that with our workers. We have to train that with our staff, with our caregivers, even with with kinship caregivers who are related potentially to this child or have a relationship. But you can't just bank everything on love. Love is necessary, but it's not everything. It's not enough. So that you really have to have skills and training, and parenting a child that you birth is very different from parenting a child who is coming to you from some maybe very hard places, or what we don't even know what their experience has been. So even Ken, who might be related to that child and know the history, are still going to need some skills and different kinds of skills to be able to minimize the trauma for that child. So this is definitely one that we struggle with, and I don't know if you are seeing this in your countries, but where we really see this is we have marketing to bring families in, and the marketing sometimes their message is these kids just need love. Just come volunteer, let these kids into your house because all they need is just somebody to love them. So the marketing message is love is enough, and then when they come in, then we have to talk to them about love isn't enough, and sometimes that's a struggle. And are we really? We're bringing in more people, but are we bringing in the right people?
And sometimes that leads back to, I think Sarah is the one that added it to our list of why so many placements, why so many movements. If they don't have that understanding that they need to do some other work than just love and hugs, then there could be issues with those placements.
And I think, all of us, it's just human nature. When we give love, we want to receive love. We want to be, when we do something good, we want that acknowledged. And kids coming that have been traumatized, we talked about, this is a placement for them. I mean, this is a trauma for them. They're not looking to us as their saviors, as their their love and support. They're not looking to us as people that have rescued them. They're seen as us as people who have created more trauma in their lives. And so it's really important for our caregivers, our adoptive families, our kinship families, to understand this placement from a child's perspective. And that you can give and give and give and give your love and do all these things, and you may not get that reciprocal love back from these children for quite some time, or other, depending on how much trauma they've had. So they have to find that strength and that motivation from somewhere else besides expecting that love back in return. Okay, so we'll just talk a little bit about some of these other ones. We put these together: best interest and least restrictive. So we do everything. Everything is couched in that best interest of the child. So we're always thinking, or we should be, we say ideally, we should be always thinking about what does this child need? What is in their best interest? So even when we're doing safety and risk, we're still thinking about what is in the child's best interest. And that is safety. But we also are talking about least restrictive when we see that there is a child that cannot stay in their home because it's not safe, and they need a safety plan that includes out-of-home placement. We are actually by law required to do least restrictive placement because it's best practice. And so least restrictive would be the family-like setting that is most like their family-like setting that they're coming from. And I know if you guys are dealing with kids coming from institutions, you're trying to think back to that, what would have been, from not comparing it to the institution, but a family-like setting. So kinship care is the least restrictive. So going to another family member, or going to a place in the community, or maybe it's a teacher, maybe it's a pastor or someone from the church, but going to someone that already has a relationship with their child. And then the next step after that is foster care. And then if foster care is not feasible, residential congregate care would be, or group homes, but family, still like a family-like setting, but moving towards that residential placement. So that's our continuum of care and our continuum of placement. And Sarah's going to talk about kinship care because that is the least restrictive, and that is our goal. When I talked about what we do in Ohio versus the ideal, we tend to go straight to foster care, and I think we're really pushing for more focus on kinship, and we're seeing that from a lot of different angles for a lot of different reasons. But you can learn from our mistakes or our struggles and think about embracing kinship care right from the very beginning. But that's what we mean by least restrictive. So when we talk to foster parents, we want them to understand the concept of least restrictive because our goal is reunification or kinship care. So even if they've gotten into foster care because we didn't have a family for them then, doesn't mean we stopped looking for family. Doesn't mean we stopped looking for kin. And if we can, we'll step that child back down to a least restrictive placement, which would be kin or family. So our foster parents need to understand that our goal is to give the child the least restrictive placement because they've got those connections. And we talked about the importance of history and identity. You're waiting until, okay, until then. All right, go ahead, Sarah.
Can I ask you a question? I just want to rewind a little bit about what you were saying about like advertising and things like that. There's a scene on that movie Instant Family.
I haven't seen it.
No,
You haven't? No, I want to see it.
Oh, you must see it. It's a good movie. But there's a scene that I'm curious to know if it's just a movie thing or if it really does happen. They have like a fair, an adoption fair, and I would like to know if that happens.
Mm.
Really?
As a former worker in a public children's service agency, yes, they use adoption fairs. They've tried to change the lingo a little bit, an adoption party. But families and children are present and mingle together. And it's a struggle as a worker to bring a child to some of those events because I haven't seen the movie, but I've seen the preview, so I know what happens. The older youth are there watching the families interact with them. But they do some where it's just for older youth, so then you're going to get maybe more interested families to talk with those older youth.
Yeah, it's always that balance of finding these children families, but also putting them in situations where we're creating more trauma, or where we're, if you are a child that's there and no one is expressing interest in you, that just reinforces probably everything that's already in their head about I'm unloved, I'm unwanted. But it also sometimes our services I think are more family driven, and we should have probably put that up there. Our goal is to find families for children, not find children for families. But sometimes I think forget and reverse.
In every step of the way, from the families coming in to the adoption.
Yeah, there's this big discussion because in our country it was forbidden to have, for example, videos with the kids introducing themselves and so on. So now we're starting to change that, but we're trying to do it in a safe way, okay? So some places go and put those videos on Facebook openly, but there's, for example, there's an app that was created by the court of Paraná, one of our states in the south. That is a very good app, in my opinion, where only the families who are able to adopt can access the videos, and the kids have a preparation, a very good preparation, that they're just going to talk about themselves. They have no promises. It's not an advertisement about them. It's just a video, and you can keep it because when you're older, it's like, a video that talks about you. So I think it's kind of safe. But that scene of the adoption fair was really weird to our culture, because it seems that they are a product.
Yes. Yeah, like the families are there shopping.
Yeah.
Yes.
We will never be allowed to. I mean, if you're a foster parent and you put a picture on any kind of media of a foster child or a place of safety child, you will lose so much trouble.
Our foster parents too, they're not allowed, well, they can't put identifying, but
Like
pictures
these kind
of,
of things that you're talking
yeah,
about.
And that's not done by the foster family, that's done by the agency is the one putting out that information.
We do promote some encounters. We do believe that that's important because we fell in love for people that we know. So many times when you promote the encounter of a family that is willing to adopt and the kids, they are going to travel from the ideal to the real kids. Then a family that was willing to adopt one child, they meet a group of siblings and they might say, oh, I can adopt these two kids or these 3 kids. So we don't avoid that, but we try to do that safely. For example, next Saturday, we're going to have this Christmas party in our city where all the kids come, okay? All the kids who are in residential and foster care, they come for this Christmas party and that's it. But the adults that are ready to adopt, they are volunteers on this party, okay? And they're not supposed to say anything to the kids. The kids don't know who they are, okay? So they're just going to play, they're going to bring food, we're going to have fun time, and that's it. If they get interested by any kid, then after all, they might talk to the professionals and then things go on. We do have some good results of that, but I still believe we really need to be very careful not to cross the line.
Absolutely. I'm going to talk a little bit about but child-specific recruitment. It seems like it fits here.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of what you're talking about, videos, helping the child create those videos, flyers, and very positive driven. We know that they have this baggage, this history, but you don't need to put all of that information out there for the whole world, the public to see. That's very important. And getting the child's approval, it's their voice, it's their life. What are you comfortable with? Where are you comfortable with this being shared? Do you want it to be on Facebook? Are you okay with it? Their peers may see some of this. I think that's important. Working with what they want to see in a family. Again, you can't make those promises, but what works best for them. You want to look for that type of family for that child.
And that conversation happens after you've explored all of the, the relatives, who did you used to go to when you had problems? Who did you feel like at school was really supportive of you, or who in your church family do you look to? So all of this kind of child-specific recruitment, looking for, I can't use the word stranger, but for an unknown family, happens after the child-specific recruitment, asking the child for who they know, who they remember, who they want to reconnect with.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm gonna jump in. That leads nicely to I have a list up there of youth voice, family voice, that sheet. And with all of the things that we've talked about, I think our system is moving more in this direction. I don't know historically if it's always been that way, but youth voice is so important because that's the reason we're here, is for the youth, to help get them to the safety, to the well-being, to the permanency. And one of our foster care alumni, I think, said this, or maybe they just repeated it, but nothing about us without us. So if you're making decisions about the child, for the child, you really need to make sure, age appropriately, of course, but even young children can say their likes, their dislikes, maybe what they used to do with their family, that were good for them, that they enjoy, that they have memorable times about. And especially the older youth, if they're coming into care and when they're older, or they're still in care when they're older, really asking them, what do they envision for their future? What do they want to see? And helping guide some of that, but getting their input as well, because that gives them a sense of control in a very chaotic period for them. It helps with that importance of identity, because then they can start thinking about, who am I? What do I want? Where do I come from? What do I remember? Who do I want to be with? Especially if you're talking to them prior to adoption, right at the beginning, who supports your family? Who have you had connections with? Because if we're not asking them, we may not know about that coach at school, or we may not know about that teacher that they have really connected with, or some other person that the primary parents may not know, but the child has daily contact with. So really open up the doors and explore all of that. Along with that, with the family voice, I know some of you are not able to work with the families. You don't know where the child has come from. But if you are aware of the family, again, asking them those same questions: who supports your family? Who has been a good support for your child? Because that leads into the expertise of the family. Even though that family is struggling currently, may not mean that they've always struggled, may not mean that they don't have any supports out there, or that they don't, the child may not know of second cousin, third removed, or whatever the lineage is that lives 3 states away, at least here in the United States. But they know their resources in their family. They know the history of the child. They know that history. So really looking to the expertise of the family. I think sometimes that gets lost because of that value laden thing of, well, they did this to the child, so how can they have any good information to provide us? How dare they do that? We're not going to talk to them or ask them those things.
What I find fascinating during the last couple of years, the development of the tools, talking with children and asking them in a child-friendly way and age-appropriate way. And yeah. Oh. I am the one who's not speaking loudly. Thank you for reminding me. I thought I was too loud anyway. So yeah. So what I'm saying is that there have been a lot of new tools developed to train professionals, foster carers, future carers, to talk with children, asking them about their feelings, about their subjective well-beings, because we are not necessarily aware of their feelings, although we have a kind of perception how they are. And also what we were doing based on a grant from the European Union, there was a tool developed to monitor the well-being of disabled children in the care system. And our UK-based colleagues were absolutely instrumental in doing. I was just responsible for the child rights part, but I'm not a disability expert. But this is a fascinating tool, non-verbal tool for children who cannot necessarily communicate verbally or have some kind of disability, on talking with them on their well-being, what are their wishes, how do they feel. So if anyone is interested, I can give you the link, and then perhaps it would be useful to use and also train the colleagues, because oftentimes I feel the professionals are using a jargon or an adult language that is not good enough for the children. So if I'm asking a child who has never been asked, how are you, or what are you feeling, how could they know?
And I was just going to say that too, be persistent with the youth voice and the family voice. In our system, we're seen as kind of the authoritarian. We're coming in, we're telling them what to do. We need to partner with them, and they may not have had that experience before, or maybe their parents have had a history with us, and it wasn't a good history. So they may not be trusting. They may not be. They're dealing with their own trauma, and the youth as well. A lot of kids may have been expected to be seen but not heard, so it's totally new to them. So being persistent and letting them know that you really do want to hear what they have to say and what their expertise is about themselves. The last thing I put on there, the system needs placement and people need connection. And I recently was watching a video of an organization here talking about kinship and just connection, how kids need connection. I'm trying to keep that in the forefront of my thought system of the system needs a placement when safety is a concern. But we're ultimately trying to reach well-being and permanency, whatever that looks like to that child, whether that's reunification, whether it's kinship, whether it's adoption. But the system needs a placement, but people need connection to achieve well-being and permanency. Because think of all of the people that you're connected with, family, socially, work. If you didn't have those, if you weren't able to feel truly connected, how lost would you feel all the time? and again, that leads back to that identity piece. You have to have an identity, a sense of identity to reach those other steps. And I think our system here, we're very focused on safety. We're starting to hopefully move toward the focus on well-being and permanency. We do safety really well, maybe overly well sometimes. But we're moving hopefully the focus a little bit, because you have to have safety to have well-being, but you have to have well-being to have permanency, and a part of that is connection.
I don't think we're going to do so later. What are you defining as kinship care?
Okay.
What is that?
Kinship care, yeah, good question. For us can be anyone related to the child through blood, adoption. I think in Ohio it's even step family. Or it can be anyone that already has a connection or a bond with that child. So it could be a church member that they see, could be a best friend's family that they're always over at their house, and it's not just, so what we call it, the term you might hear from our area is fictive kin. So they're like family, they're kind of the chosen family of that child, but not related in any way. It's a wider net, yeah.
Somebody that has a relationship.
Somebody, yeah, so it couldn't be some just random teacher at their school that they've never
Well, are
really,
you looking to those people to become the placement for the child?
it could be either. We're looking at, I think a lot of people think of it just as placement, but with that connection piece, yeah, we're thinking long-term. So even if they're in foster care, let's say aunt couldn't take them for various reasons, but that connection, we want to keep that connection because it's a permanency piece and a well-being. Because even if they're with a different family that they don't know, but aunt is still coming in and taking them to an appointment or meeting with them every Saturday.
So even if the placement is not there, you maintain.
Yes, the connection. Yeah.
I wrote up here for emotional permanency. So the idea is to establish a network for that child of multiple. There's one model that says 40, multiple connections or reconnections to people that were already in your life, and then from that, the goal is to then find someone that can become that legal permanent placement. But yeah, it's not just looking for placement.
Yeah, and I think the permanent connection is the key. For some people say, well, how can I say it's going to be for lifetime? Things change. Well, but if you're looking, you feel that it could be permanent, that right now you want it to maintain. So.
I just have a follow-up question on that is, I'm thinking what kind of infrastructure would you need to build on that? Because I suppose every child would need a kind of an individualized network of information, I suppose. And how is that sort of built into the system that you're using?
I think it varies greatly because we're just now moving in that direction. Some of our agencies are doing like family group decision making. So at the front end, when it's decided that child can't remain with parents, they search and they bring in as many family members or kin, because it doesn't have to just be family. But they have these big meetings and they all sit in a room and the family makes the plan for the child, which means grandma's gonna take them, but uncle's gonna take them to school every day. Teacher is gonna take them for coffee every Saturday or whatever. So sometimes it's that informal network is making that plan. Then we have other programs like 30 days to family. So they're saying within 30 days of the child coming into care, how many connections can we make? So that's more of the professional reaching, searching, finding, and then seeing who can be put into place. So I don't know that we have a lot of formalized ways of doing that as far as infrastructure. It's just like you said, it's a case by case. It's kind of agency by agency. But the focus is just to get those connections made, and then hopefully they can really work that out as they move through the process.
And we make the decision in terms of, let's say we've got limited information about that child. I think that's pretty much in developing countries that you find. And then from there on to ask the child, I suppose, where would you feel safest going? I suppose, because that's why the child needs to sort of contribute to that decision making.
Someone had asked about history, and I think this is a good point because it's kind of, we we're kind of circling back around because we did have a lot of informal kinship care in the beginning, before our foster care. And then we kind of came up with this sense or this feeling that I think somebody said it on Monday, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So we thought, well, if their primary parents aren't good, then probably their extended family isn't good. Let's get them out of this environment. Let's get them in these foster homes that we've licensed, we've assessed. They're probably living in a nicer community, nicer houses. Let's get them in those homes. And then what we were seeing as a system is we could not meet the demand for permanency that we had. So we had lots of kids that were lingering in foster care, and multiple placements, lingering in foster care, just waiting. So our system said, okay, let's take these kids that have been in foster care the longest and really try to focus on finding placements for them. And so then we started looking at, okay, let's dig up in our files. Let's look and see if we can find those family members, find those people that they might have been connected with, an old foster family that, their first placement that seemed to work, but the family moved out of state. So then we started doing this for the lingering children, and we realized it was working. It made sense. And so light bulb went off. Let's start this at the very beginning,
At the front door.
at the front door. Why do we want to wait until these kids have been lingering in foster care for years and experienced multiple placements, multiple traumas? Let's start at the very beginning of finding family, connecting them to people that they already have, reconnecting them to people they already have connections with. So historically, we've kind of come full circle, and we're still, I'd say we've come full circle. We have change agents like ourselves that are pushing for coming, but we still have that, I think some people still have that attitude of, let's not use the family because they're not, they've got issues, they've got problems, or they would have stepped up in the first place if we wouldn't be in the situation. So we're still fighting that.
Yeah, and just as an example of some of that for what she was talking about, the family finding at the back end, for the kids that have lingered or have multiple placements, some agencies are now doing, they're called permanency roundtables, where they're bringing in the youth and really thinking outside the box for permanency. Where can this child go for permanency? And they have found that, a child that's been in care for, let's say, 8 years in the system, there's been a couple cases where that child is actually placed back with their primary family, because in that 8 years, a lot has changed for the primary family. They've been able to overcome the obstacles that they had, and the permanency is actually back with their primary family. Whereas before, I don't know that would have really been happening legally. But if they hit the 18 and they're aging out of the system, many of our kids go back to their primary families anyway with no supports.
Go back to what they know.
Yeah, what they know, where their identity, where their history is, and if we're not assisting in that could, have not great outcomes as well.
I think we touched on most of these. I wrote a couple of more up here. Sarah mentioned Nothing About Us Without Us, which is also that, goes into that youth voice. On the trauma, and you may have heard this, but we kind of we have been in the past coming at kids with, what's wrong with you? You're stealing, you're lying, you're oppositional, defiant. That's one of our terms we use, where you're not following authority, you're not listening to authority. What's your problem? What's wrong with you? And as we become more trauma informed and understand what trauma does to the brain and what trauma does to the child's behavior, we've got this new question that's what's happened to you? It's a much more strengths-based, a much more empathetic response and understanding. So that's another philosophy that we're philosophical different, where we're trying to get the shift from not looking at what behaviors are, but looking past those behaviors of what is that child feeling inside that would make them have those behaviors, and what does that child bring with them? What is that child experience? What is that history that would make them want to do this behavior or behave in that way? What are they feeling? So that's another one of those concepts that we're trying to change. And we talked about emotional permanency, but we wanted to ask you guys if there are additional, we're just calling them philosophies, principles. We weren't really sure what the right terminology was, but when we talk about systems change, are there some of those key points that, and mindset changes. So thinking about things differently in terms of foster care. Are there ones that we've missed or that we've forgotten? Are there other ones that we think we should discuss?
One of the things, Kelly, as I look up here, and I know you're going to address it, but I just want to mention it. In many of the countries, there is a very fast, from the time I want a child to getting a child, it's very, very quick. It's almost like going to the market and picking out a tomato. You kind of look them over and, pat their buns and say, that one seems to look like me, I'll take it. And it's very, very, very quick. So one of hopefully the paradigms that we can introduce and really to be focused on would be the importance of preparing families. And I know this is what we're all about here, but it is a real barrier because right now legally, if you go through the paperwork and you've done your paperwork, whatever is required in different countries, it can be as short as 2 weeks, and you've got a child in your home in permanency. And 1 week for you? So
3 days.
No way.
3 days? Yeah.
5 years.
And
We can go to 6 years.
oh, you can go to 6 years. And Gulia just adopted, and it took one week. 1 week for permanency, and it's just done. So there's a whole paradigm there that really needs to be challenged, and it's a real serious issue that we have because we understand that we're bringing in the best practice of preparing foster adoption and kinship families, but at the same time is that families have a legal right to bypass that and to get families within their, pat the bum and 1 week later.
So you're mentioning preparing families. Isn't the child also supposed to be prepared?
And that is another dynamic in terms of looking at that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the places where we fall short sometimes here in the States. But we did, I'm trying to figure out when we should take a break now, or if we should, do people need a break, or? We kind of started later. Keep going?
Keep going for a
All
while.
right. So I think you kind of bring up a good point and a good segue. I want to do one thing, and then we're going to go to talk about who are the people that need trained and prepared, because that's really important. So we're just moving on to number 2 on our agenda. So,
Kelly?
yeah.
One other thing that you're asking about other points that need to be made.
Yes.
And this is something that I don't think we much thought about because everybody came into it with a rescue mentality. But the truth is that if you put a child into a family where the environment is so different from what they know, different sounds, different smells, different communities, different kinds of discipline, different ways people react, you increase the stress of the trauma.
Absolutely.
And so least restrictive also means culturally as much like the family that they came from. It's in their best interest, but you run into community's perceptions.
Yes.
Those kinds of families aren't good enough to care for kids, which is why you go back to safety and risk. Those are the categories that you have to use to make the decision about whether a child's going to be safe here, not whether my values are such that I'm going to place this child in a family that I would like to grow up in.
Yeah.
That's a very important training piece because intuitively people think everybody's ethnocentric. Everybody believes that what they know and believe is the right thing. It's human nature. So you're going to miss lots and lots of really good placement resources for a child. You're going to discount them because of how you see the world. And that's fighting that battle is a huge challenge. But build it in from the beginning. We're not rescuing. And you can use trauma as the reason that the farther we place a child from what they know, the more trauma they will experience. And the harder it will be for them to adjust. And this is in your books and your field guides. But I guess I want to make, you've already said it in about 5 different ways. I want to articulate it as a central point as you're building your systems, that you say, this is not about rescue. This is about the child's best interests. And least restrictive means least different from what they know.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think we struggle with that as caseworkers too. Yeah, like Judy said, we find the house that we think we would like the best, and not think about what's the best placement for that child. Absolutely. So before we go on to the who,
Sarah, did you have?
oh, sorry.
Yeah.
We missed that.
I just
Sorry,
heard
Sarah.
the intake of air.
Thank you, Sarah. I was just wondering here, we probably do have some very different situations here in this room about fostering. For example, in Brazil, foster families are not encouraged to foster because of the money. They do receive some money, but they say that the authorities say that the foster families are volunteers,
Right.
and the money is to help them with the needs of the child.
Yes. that's
Okay.
what it is.
We do know that in some countries, they treat that differently, like in some European countries, for example. One of the things that our authorities are afraid of, and in my opinion, it's ridiculous, is that if they demand too much of these foster families, they are not going to have any foster families. For example, if we tell them that they need to be on training for 60 hours, they're not going to come, and we're not going to have even one foster family, okay? So I don't know if you have had this kind of problem in the past, or if you do have it nowadays, and how do you deal with that?
So there is a movement right now. Our pre-service, and we'll talk about that I think later this afternoon. Our pre-service is 36 hours of training for. So if a family, whether they're kinship, if they're going to get licensed as a kinship family or a foster family or a adoptive parent, they have to go through 36 hours of training. And
It's a different kind of training, or is it?
it's
about the same?
they're in training all together because it's foundational. So
Okay.
it's that kind of like that core that you guys talked about, what's core, specialized,
Yeah.
related. So it's the core. It's foundational for everybody.
And that's before they become.
That's actually before they get, what we do is licensure or approval for foster or adoptive families. So, but there is a push here because that's a state. It's not nationwide. That's state 36 hours. So there is a push. What we're seeing is we have an opioid crisis here, and particularly in Ohio. So a lot more kids are coming into care. So we have a higher demand for foster care than we have. We're not doing such a great job of using our
Yeah, I
kinship
would say-
resources.
I would say we have a higher demand for placement,
Yeah,
and the focus is on
it's
foster
on
care.
foster care. That's true.
Or placement should be wide open for kinship or foster. Sorry.
Right. No,
My
you're
kinship
right.
hat, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So we're still heavily relying on foster care placement. So the push is to get those foster parents through licensure process quicker so that we can have more foster parents. So there's a push to decrease the number of hours that they're getting in training. There's a push to lessen some of the criteria that they have to have. And so and there's a lot of pushback and a lot of struggle between that. So, there's not research out there to say, this is the perfect number of hours they need in training. This is the perfect way to train them. This is exactly what so it's a lot of trial and error. And so because we don't have that data or the research to say this is what they need, so then we're getting pushed that, okay, well, let's get it through faster, let's get it through quicker. And we know probably that if we don't put in some other pieces, if we're just taking away things, we're going to have multiple placements, we're going to have disruptions because families aren't going to be adequately prepared. But it's that, I think it just comes down to educating and knowing who your advocates are, and for us in government, who makes the law, and getting to them and making sure that they understand.
So you have this 36 hours, 6-hour training for pre-services. So you have it all together, foster, adoption,
We
kinship in
do
the same
for right
one.
now, yeah.
Then do you have another kind of training for specific areas? Yes. And how long are these trainings?
It varies widely. So we can talk about that in the afternoon.
Sure.
When we get to that, what training do they need?
Sorry if I'm too
But no,
anxious.
that's fine. But yeah, you're right. So, but it does go back to that. What is core? What is foundational for everyone? What does everybody need? And And pre-service, because it's prior to licensure, we're also using that as a self-assessment piece because we want them to be informed when they make a decision whether foster care, adoption, or kinship care is for them. So that training is really focused on raising their awareness about all the things they need to think about. Because love isn't enough. What are all the things that they need to think about to really make an informed decision? A good example of that is we get people calling all the time saying, oh, I can't possibly fit 36 hours of training into my schedule. Can you waive it for me? Is there something else I can do? And we tell them back, if you can't get 36 hours of training in, you're going to have a child in your home that potentially is going to have visits with a family, visits with a caseworker, court. It's a lot more counseling, maybe therapy, occupational therapy. These kids have high needs and they're going to need a lot of support and time. And if you don't have their time to give towards training for 36 hours, is this really something that you have the time to do?
If I just might say that based on the European experiences so far and other experiences, the professionalization of foster care and employment of foster care in a growing number of countries is resolving part of this problem. Because part of the issue is whether foster carers need another job or they are volunteering. And that means that they've got limited time to devote to children or to service. But if you can professionalize it, and this is the direction, I guess, because less and less people can afford actually volunteering. And the kids are more and more demanding, and there are fast-growing expectations towards the foster care. So I guess if this is the case, then obviously we can expect more from them to invest into their own training and readiness for having the regular contact. So it's not just that wonderful, nice little ones are coming to our family and we love them all. So it's with the opioid crisis, obviously, I would say that they need much more training than less because the kids are having very complex needs. So I find it very important that we don't have research and evaluation available, but we should know more about the reasons why there is this fear that the foster parents refuse. Is probably this kind of anxiety that what if I'm not good enough or it's too demanding. So that we should know more about it, and I wouldn't let this kind of pressure decreasing the numbers.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that we have come to be okay with the decrease in hours for pre-service. It wasn't a battle that we were going to be able to win to keep it to 36. I think it is going to go decrease the number of hours. But what we're also pushing for is okay. So once they get, kind of answering your question, but once they get trained and they get approved or licensed, it's kind of, there's nothing else for them that's standardized. It's just kind of whatever they feel like taking in terms of training right now. So what we're pushing is let's decrease. We'll let you have less pre-service hours. We'll agree to that. But what we want in return is let's have some standardized training once they get licensed right from the very beginning.
Great.
Another issue we have here, while we don't have good data about the effectiveness of pre-service, is because for us it's a very long process. It can be 6 months, a year before they would get placement from the time they went to the training. And so we can't show, who remembers what, I hardly remember what we talked about on Monday in this class, Who's going to remember? It doesn't matter how good that training is. If it's a year later when you have to use that information, are you really going to remember it? And so that's where we're struggling. So that's where we've said, okay, let's go ahead and decrease pre-service, but let's get some more training in when they're licensed and closer to the time that they're going to get placement, so that they remember what they're learning and they get refreshed, and then we can also go a little deeper. So it's not just, now they're not just deciding whether foster care or adoption or kinship care is for them. Now they're getting ready to take a placement, so it becomes more real. So let's go a little deeper with our training. So that's how we sometimes you don't get to make those choices. Like we don't get to choose that we're going to stay for 36 hours, but how can we work with that, and how can we figure out a way to continue to get the training that they need?
Kelly, do you have any chance, or do you know numbers, maybe for Ohio, maybe for Franklin County, of number of families who come to pre-service and then actually go through?
Yeah, we actually just here in Ohio, and this is again, we have a public training system, which is what we're representing, and then there are lots of private agencies in Ohio that are doing their own pre-service training. So just on the public system, we train about 2,000 people a year in pre-service. So about 2,000 people go through our 36 hours of training because they think they want to become an adoptive parent or a kinship care provider or a foster parent. We haven't been tracking. The last time we tracked the drop-off rate was about 40%, which is really high, really high. But yes, but when we think about assessment,
Gave up.
stop.
Okay.
Yeah, but we think that's good
Yeah,
because we're
exactly.
hoping they're dropping out because they realize this isn't for them. Yes, it's not for them. So we don't want necessarily 100%. But the other piece we have is also, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes our marketing is not bringing in this and the people that are really right for this. We're bringing in, we're casting a wider net when we market, and we're hoping maybe some of them will still stick around after they've heard the rest of the story. But I think it's about 40. We're actually working right now with our evaluator to do some tracking so we can get a better handle on how many people get licensed after they go through. But we'll just be starting that in January, so we won't have any data, probably anything worth looking at until probably June.
So did you
Just a
say,
quick comment on that?
Yeah.
Well, there are two things we've been trying to somehow breach the time, this empty time, so to say, between the training and the placement. One is offering a monthly meeting, a kind of self-help group where they can discussing all their dilemmas, inviting experienced foster carers and adoptive parents and kinship carers to talk about the issues. So that's relatively cheap because, right. And the other thing is that utilizing the standby prepared foster carers as emergency foster carers, because that means that we can see how they are working, we can support them if they need more help, but also this means that during a very short period of time they can try whether it's working or not before placing children for a longer period of time. So these are two tricks, so to say, to overcome this barrier.
There's an agency that I recently heard that they said that their foster parents have to provide respite care.
Exactly.
Not emergency, but
Yeah,
we
but
plan,
respite,
but
that's
respite
also
care
an
prior to a
yeah.
placement so that they can find what their strengths
exactly.
and needs are.
I might,
Kelly?
I might have missed it, but how do you identify those 2,000?
We don't as our agency doesn't identify them. They're coming in at, we have 88 counties. So our 88 public counties are going out and doing their own recruiting and finding families. And then they send their families to one of our 8, we have 8 regional training centers across the state. And they're the training centers are the ones that offer the pre-service. So we just looked in January, I think we have 10 rounds of pre-service starting. So
Wow.
at all over the state, we have, so people probably wouldn't have to drive more than maybe an hour at the very most to get to a training class that's starting, and then they take that training with their cohort if they can.
So the local counties
The
actually
local
advertise.
counties, yes, the local counties work. It's a collaborative process. So we are more on the development arm, the Institute for Human Services. So we write the curriculum, we prepare the trainers, we provide support to the trainers, we update curriculum. So our 8 regional training centers actually deliver the training, and they serve. So there'd be a hub, a training center surrounded by our counties. And so everybody and those surrounding counties, they recruit their own families, but they send them physically to that location, to the regional training center to attend training for pre-service. So our pre-service classes, they can be, they may be only 10 people. Some of our regional training centers will run parallel groups, so they'll have 60 people. So they'll hire 2 trainers to run the same exact training in 2 different rooms at the same time.
After they're licensed for fostering, do they usually wait for a long time to receive first kids?
I think it's, I don't know what the stats are, but historically, they have had to wait for a while, but because we have so many kids in care right now, in Ohio, we have about 12, 14, I'm trying to remember, 1,000 children in foster care.
Yeah, I think it's closer to
14 or
14,
16, it may be
I think
16.
16 actually.
Yeah, that's right. I'm trying to do the math here. I'm not very good at math. I think we have about 16,000 children in foster care placement, and we have about 7,200 foster homes. So even if every foster home took 2 children, we don't have enough foster homes to place all of those children. So we're in a crisis. So we're trying to. So because of that, they're going to get placement probably sooner.
And do they choose the file of kid that they want to foster?
We have a matching process, and yeah. So as part of their assessment process, they go through what's called a child characteristic checklist. Thank you. And so they will literally check, male or female. They'll check what kind of disabilities they think they can have. They will check what age. So there's a very lengthy checklist. And so when a child comes up in need of placement, then and this is where I think the ideal and the reality clash a little bit. So ideally, as a worker, you would look through and find the best placement, the best match. Look at what the characteristics of the child are, and look at what this family has to offer and match. But there are such a need for foster homes that workers are not able to do that matching in the way.
Done physically or is it?
Just looking at the characteristics, like basically looking at 2 physical
It's done by
checklists. Here's what the
a
child
person.
has. But we also don't get as much information as we'd like about the child when they come into placement. So that's a barrier. So ideally, that matching would happen sometimes. And the reality of it is, if there's an open bed, the child is going there.
I'm sorry, does StackList help with that piece? Or is it just it's not automated at all?
That's what I want to know. Is it
Yeah, that's what
automated?
I think she
No,
said.
that was
No.
mine.
It's
Yeah,
not
I
automated.
don't know.
And that matching kind of can happen at 2 different points.
Yeah.
We use that term, very in the very beginning. So as a person who used to sit down and go over that checklist with the family, a lot of educating them on some of what that actually might be, and then helping them realize too, like, where is the discrepancy? Okay, you said you would accept this, maybe they don't want sexually acting out behaviors, but they said they would accept a child who was sexually abused. So it's a lot of education.
And that's happening at the assessment.
At the
prior
assessment
to
process.
placement.
And then it can happen again later because sometimes those families, change their mind, or and then adoption. There's a whole nother, matching those checklists again.
And how many kids can they foster?
It's gonna vary. I think the maximum is 6, but you can have, if it's sibling group, there's some ways that they can open up that door for more. But I think that's a fairly recent, in the last couple of years, rule, because we were seeing families taking in lots and lots of children, and we know that those kids have high needs, and it's just at a point you can't be 2 places at once. You can't provide all of those services that a child needs and have that many kids in the home. But this issue with matching goes to speak to your question about how can somebody end up in so many placements. I think at the heart of that is our struggle with matching, and maybe from the very beginning, sometimes we might know that this isn't going to work out, or this isn't the best, but we place them there and we cross our fingers and hope we can provide support and make the placement work. And so I think one of our struggles is getting that placement, that matching piece right.
It's like information about the kid is crucial.
Right, which we don't always have. So I think that's all.
Are the foster parents paid? Are they doing an allowance for?
They have a stipend, so they get
Each child?
per child and based on the child's needs. That should, so if you have a higher needs child that might need specialized daycare or might need therapy,
And
counseling.
do you think that's a motivation for some people getting into?
I don't think it is, and if they come into it because that's their motivation, I don't think they'll stay very long, because we know, as
No, these are difficult kids to have in your home. I mean, some of these kids can have rages, they can destroy property, they can make it, you're not gonna get invited to your friends'
Mhm.
party if you're bringing this child who's gonna destroy their house, you know, so any concern that we might have that a foster parent might be getting for money and might be taking harder kids because they're getting more money. I just don't, to me, that just, you know, those people get weeded out because once they experience it, they can't handle it. It's not worth the money.
Also, during your matching process, do you get to interact with the child? Do they get to see the child?
I would say mostly at the adoptive place, but not at the foster. Most of our foster care placements are kind of emergency, unless they're moving from one foster home to the other. It's typically, and that's where I'd say, you know, the ideal doesn't, we don't already always do the ideal, but that's why we want to talk about what is the ideal. The ideal is doing that matching and interacting. That would be wonderful if we could have. There are some places where they place children in like a very temporary setting so that they can do visits with foster family, so that foster family can visit and then make sure that it's a good match before they do that placement. But then there's the problem of, okay, but now we put this child in a temporary, very temporary placement, and what if we don't find a match? You know, is that placement going to become? So there's a lot. I think that's probably, in my opinion, that's one of the biggest struggles we have with foster care, because if we don't get that placement match right at the very beginning, we're always playing catch up, and we're always trying to provide additional support and services, and it's taking out workers' time. It's taking, you know, we're burning out our foster parents. We're traumatizing that child. So the need for a good placement is and a good match is critical, but the ability to do a good match, because of all the factors that come into that, it's a struggle.
I think there's a whole systemic issue that probably affects all of us. I think certainly this underlies it. And that is when you have lots and lots of kids, as we do with the opiate epidemic, who can't be safe at home, there just aren't enough people who have the capacity to be able to manage these kids well and who are wanting to become foster parents. They have 6 children of their own. They work full-time jobs. So we do have to sometimes take, Kelly's point is, where there's a bed, we're glad there's a bed. And it's absolutely not the right thing to do. But we're limited. And I think that may be why institutional care is so attractive, because they'll always take a child.
Right.
Right. And for, you know, rather than the struggle to find the right family, you know, we have this settled. And I don't know how to crack that one. That one's been an issue in the 45 years I've been in the field. And I don't know that we have an answer. I think since part of the problem of kids bouncing out of placement is because they're in placements that don't work for them, where they have no connections and they feel like they've been sort of, you know, sent away. Hopefully getting communities to understand that with a certain level of services, and I think this was Jeff's point earlier, with a certain number of community services, we can, you know, prevent that kid from having to come into foster care at all. And they'll be good enough in their own extended families, then we can probably solve that problem another way. But it's not going to work by getting more and more and better and different kinds of foster families. That's not where it needs to be. It needs to be going back the other way so that we have fewer kids who need foster care.
Right. But I think a piece of that from a kinship perspective too is, I think a lot of foster families here don't want to work with or don't want to have connection with the primary family or the extended family, because their view is they weren't safe with you, they're with me, they're safe, I'm not going to allow any of that interweaving. And I think our state is trying to change that with they're coming out with like new marketing pieces of, you know, walk alongside the family, you're here to help the family, not just the child. But I think some of the stability within placements could be helped with those connections. Doesn't have to be the placement with the kin, but those connections of aunt can still be involved, teacher can still be involved, even if they've moved school districts, but allowing those connections to remain so that that child isn't so completely isolated in a totally different placement.
Yeah.
So I think that hopefully that's my long-term view.
Well, one of the programs, since we're watching, they're researching it to see how it's going to work, but to deal with the opiate crisis, is by returning children to their families, but assigning them peer mentors, basically who are families who have already experienced drug problems, have been through treatment, are sober, and they really do walk alongside with the intent of trying to support this other family to get through the same process to keep their children. So it's much more community-based. And again, we're using people from the family's own culture, people they can relate to provide support and help, which is, in many situations, that can work. If the family is just plain dangerous for a child, it's not going to. But I suspect if we did that with all kids that we pull into foster care, because of the fear of liability, that's what's driving this for our agencies. The agencies are afraid that if they leave the children in the extended families and something happens, they're going to be sued. And it happens. So the fear of liability means they bring them in where they think the agency is safe. But if we can, I would guess that maybe half of the kids that come into care could be diverted out of care if we had, those level 2 services on your chart that we were talking about the other day, where you work with families at risk so that you can prevent placement altogether.
And that's what I think our new federal legislation
Exactly.
is hoping to do. I mean, federal law can't change practice, I guess people's mindset, but we're hoping that that's where we'll go.
Starts the conversations.
And I think with that too, that it helps if you have those services there, but the family is continually marching towards crisis, you're aware of it, so then you can be doing that family search and engagement prior to the crisis. So when crisis occurs, you're like, okay, we have grandma, Aunt Joe, Uncle Sam, all of these different possibilities that we're not having to place out of their culture or across the state, so they're not even close to their family, so that you have all of those resources kind of on deck in case. We call that a little bit of, here we call it concurrent planning, but doing it before the child welfare piece.
Is the barrier to that the resources to just do the searching and to do the finding?
And to build that kind of a service system,
Yeah, I think
we
that's the
had
main
it.
barrier.
It's political. We had it here for years as part of the welfare department. It was, funded by the government, and it was basic social services. And over the years, I don't know, they stopped. For any of you who know the political history here of the difference between Aid for Families with Dependent Children, AFDC, which was the financial subsidy that was given to families at poverty level to keep, and it was indefinite. It could go forever. And when they tried to reform welfare because of the huge cost involved, they limited the amount of time people could receive the subsidy, and they also cut out all of the supportive services. So all these kids are now coming into the child welfare system, the child protective system, because there is nothing else. And it's absolutely, backwards. They're shooting themselves because they're spending more money on placements than they would otherwise. But we don't, that's why, again, that's the childonomics piece of helping people understand that the investment of early services prevents much more expenditures later. But there's a huge psychological cost to that also, because you're always responding to emergencies. So it would be lovely if all the rest of you in earlier stages of development can push for the family support services rather than push for foster care. And that's what scares me the most about the deinstitutionalization movement, is everybody thinks foster care is the answer and it's going to fix it, rather than recognizing it's just a step to a different kind of problem, rather than putting all the emphasis on family-based care and family supports. And you guys are doing a lot of that because you're looking at building the churches as a huge support network, which is really a very effective way to increase the amount of supportive services in communities. But again, getting the churches to step up and do that, it's It's a big order.
Once someone told me that you have something in the States like establish like a number, like criteria for kids' behavior. For example, if a child is a baby, it would be like level 1. If it's a very dangerous or abusive kid.
For
it would
foster
be-
care payment? you mean?
Yeah, yeah. Then it would be number 5, and if I'm not mistaken, number 4 and 5 wouldn't go to families until they come
Yes.
to level 3. Could you explain that a
Yeah,
little bit?
It's not as structured as that. I mean, I think it's not as universal. That's what I should say,
Uh-huh.
because they've tried to make it universal here, at least in the state. They ran a pilot, and there's just a lot of disagreement about what do those levels look like, and then how much money should we attach to those levels. But in general terms, yes. So that a child is assessed with whatever criteria the agency is using, kind of see where they fall in terms of what kind of needs are they going to have, how much effort basically is it going to take for this foster parent to keep this child in their home in a stable placement. And so that money goes to that foster parent. And that is true, at a certain level, they just kind of say, well, this is a residential child. And I think where you're going with that, and the problem with that is it's not a unique assessment of the child. We're lumping them, and if they meet this criteria, we put them in congregate care, and without looking specifically what are those needs for that child, and maybe there's somewhere else that child, are we really looking at the least restrictive placement for that child? So I think that is when you have these levels, and you do these assessments, and this child goes here, it's easier for a caseworker because there's not a lot of critical thinking involved in that. There's just follow this path, and this is where the results. But best interest, at least restrictive, really requires some high level critical thinking and evaluation specific to that child. And I think we're getting there in training, but critical thinking is a hard thing to train. It's a hard thing, you kind of you get it or you don't, and it's hard to get people to think that. And we've been working towards that, but I think those levels are just because it's easier. But we do end up bulking kids into places where maybe they should be.
I have a question in terms of the placement of the foster care and the child themselves, and how we match those two together. So is that all done manually, I suppose, case by case?
Yes, but again, that's where we were. Judy said we find a bed that's open sometimes, and may not be the best
And that
place.
could affect retention, I suppose, as well. And would there be any look towards the system that could work with algorithms to identify particulars, if there would be enough foster care? I
Yeah,
suppose?
there are some efforts going towards that with what were they calling that? They've changed the name a couple times, but they were looking at past cases and past histories and trying to come up with predictive
So like a
analytics.
trend.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I think there might be, but again, when you
But
start
expectation
relying
is
on those
reality,
logarithms,
sure.
and you don't also, I think that's super important, very important to have that data, but also that critical thinking of that caseworker, knowing what are all those other factors that maybe
Not
aren't being
straightforward,
included, right? So what,
You need someone to know that child and know that family well.
Specific, yeah.
Bring them.
Yeah, but Kelly, were they? I didn't know that they were using predictive analytics
They've
for the
changed-
matching.
They've changed the
I
name.
thought they were just using it for
Risk.
risk,
Oh,
safety, and
Risk of
risk,
intake,
yeah,
pretty much.
to determine whether they if they're more at risk and may need placement
But
rather than actual matching.
I think they were also using it for level of placement, level of care.
I don't. They
Oh.
could be.
I'm not sure, but maybe that's that.
They were trying to build systems for, and actually Cuyahoga County had that whole, I don't know how much data they put into it, but they were trying to take case data and use it to drive the level of care, the level of complexity of care based on the case data. And I don't know where that went.
Yeah, well, they tried to use, they did a pilot study on a trauma tool to try and figure out level of care for the child, and that didn't work either. So we're still matching, as we said, matching is as critical as it is so difficult to get it right. We're still struggling with that. Still struggling.
I'm looking
We need a
at,
break.
yeah, do we need
Yeah.
a break? Okay, let's take a break. You guys can go get some coffee. So how long is it?
15 minutes.
15 minutes?
Yeah.
All right, so it's basically 11:25, so 11:40? All right.
Super.
When we were, in the beginning of the day, discussing, the questions and, the topics that we would like to discuss, I think it was mentioned on Monday. I forgot to mention it and whether it was towards you to talk about permanency of tables.
Oh, yes, Sarah can talk about that. I know, we're like.
That's.
We can move on.
A great question.
No,
Yeah.
but I know.
So we'll try when we come back to just kind of push it forward into some of the more specific.
You know,
It's like our cost is going to be somewhere between $30 and $35 a person. The entire one. And so
Yes.
This one.
Yes, we can. We were also.
So this is all Lake Rock up here. That's pizza on a
Jelly
jelly sandwich. So let me ask you this, this is for this jelly sandwiches and lasagna one day or is this Friday? Jelly sandwich one day and bread lasagna the next day. And rolls with lasagna and then delivery. So. Great.
Yeah.
I just said my sweater on the chair and it's been my body, I just have to switch it back and
So anyway, it's phone number, the hall, some food, and the handout. It's pretty reasonable. So for 50 people, it's $34. So if it were for 25, it'd be twice as much, it'd be $65.
Wow. Okay.
I was asking for 50 people. You know, less people. It's probably not good if you only got half of it. I think we pay some.
So $35
Yes, and
per
the
person.
You go from 35 and you go to 30. And
Yeah. I'm sure we
keep much-
She was in foster care. We talked about that. She starts with some behaviors and she sent to this. Yeah.
The process of-
And the end of that.
Yeah. Yeah. So is it more like monster in real life? I know that sometimes movies are so good.
I know. That is another.
And I think that's where we are. I know Ohio's number. Whereas it's like, foster care, 21 residential, three is adopted. So.
Are we going to get this paper?
I think it's just Ohio, so. There you go.
This is interesting. Thank you.
So if you wanted to like on this, yeah, I'll write that down. And then this is last year, almost a year and a half ago now. Over time, the number of kids that was 13,000 on the property service. You know how to do it. And they're estimating that we're going for our numbers by 2020 will be 21,000. Because of the drugs, yeah. So switching from opioids to meth But there's just, it is affecting, I think with this rather than the crackhead epidemic, which is wrong, I've done any research, but, it's affecting the generational levels. So you used to be able to mom, and you used to be able to go grandma, but now it's like it's family. So you can't, so you're having someone else people entering, against children entering into care, their extended families are so affected by the crackhead.
Actually, like, there's, I mean, so the local grandma works
Specifically here in Ohio, which is still like what.
I wonder if they would think that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Overdose, drug use right now.
So
I think we reached the peak, they say, last year. Deaths and cases and all of that, but, it's been unfortunately.
Yes, crack is a serious. Most of the times, this, nurses are addicted to crack. Really can't get to it at home because if they are forced.
Right now, most of the way that children get identified is because someone has contact tracers.
So I think I will add this to the send list.
That's generally how they're coming into our
care.
care, that somebody in the community has called and said, "We need to work with them." We're hoping, we'd like to see education, we'd like to see more, we'd like to see that so even if they are going to process it sooner than we would, so we'd like to see that.
Specialized system that we're in.
Right,
So,
right.
And then we then look at assessing the child when they've been referred. Let's see what kind of extended family ties they have. Right? Is the direction to obviously push it straight through in the direction of extended family for the permanency?
That's the goal at first, and because that would be the least restrictive.
Sure.
And it's extended family, but it's also,
Kinship?
kinship,
Sure.
yes,
So
it's
that's-
also, it might be contacting, maybe they have a sibling that was adopted 5 years ago, so it might be contacting that adopted family and saying, "Are you interested?"
So even an adopted family.
Yeah, because we consider kinship now by blood or by adoption.
Okay. So that obviously extends that permanency. And so that would be the first event that you would basically to contact on buffer.
Right.
The second would be then obviously adoption would be the
Well, the second would probably be foster. I mean,
Foster.
the goal is kinship care first. If you can't find a kin, then foster care. And then you're looking at permanency. So because this is all temporary, what we're talking about. So now we've got to think about where in this child. So reunification is a permanency option. Returning that child back to the family option, or to the kinship caregivers, and letting the kinship caregiver adopt. And then adoption is an option. So it doesn't go straight to adoption. It goes consideration for permanency. Adoption is probably, should probably put that up there. So if you like visuals, I imagine other people like visuals. Yeah.
Trying to see how the system works.
So we were trying to think about that. So child, you have a child, and they. So the least restrictive is the
And then we're going to ask, does the aunt take the child?
that includes adopted families.
In terms of physical location.
And then we also could do foster, but that's not least. which is our group homes, residential settings, those are not very family-like.
Yeah, they're not, and they're actually more exposed to this.
Yeah, so that orphanages are
Yeah.
So then from here, from wherever that child is in placement here, this is all temporary. And so then we want, so we're looking for permanency. And so what we can have is we want reunification.
And that process is done by the state. So that would be backtracking for relatives.
Well, that would be, reunification would be going back to the family, birth family. So in our system, maybe mom was doing drugs, and so we had to take a kid out of home. The goal would be to get mom support services, get her sober, so that then we can return that child back to that.
It's almost like rehabilitation for the family versus
Yes, yes, so that would be the number one. And that is typically what the goal is for most kids when we talk about the permanency goal. It's typically reunification. Most of the kids in our system that come to foster care do eventually go back to their home.
Is there also a focus, because I know you mentioned that there's high focus on kids, not so more on families. So is there like a parallel process that one also looks at, let's say the mother was a drug addict, to rehabilitate her, to stabilize her, and then return the child?
Yes, that's what this reunification is.
So that's a whole parallel process.
Yes, so it's providing supports to the child while they're in care and helping support the child, but it's also providing support to the parent. So they have a what we call a case plan, family case plan. And this is all the things that the family needs to do to get their child back. So that's that rehabilitation. And then, so if reunification doesn't work, then we would probably look at relatives. So it's the whole
Seed.
then if that didn't work, then we would look at.
Seeds here yesterday. Somebody else wants seeds.
Yeah, we actually have.
I try not to.
I understand that.
I mean, I think you can mitigate those, but
Yeah, sure.
the potential for higher rate of harm, definitely. So in
And
the
there is a
early
time,
ones,
so there is a timeline.
Yes.
Going on. We hope that there wouldn't be.
Sometimes I feel I do, but right. So 12 months, and I'll explain that, but this is, so the goal is 24 months, 2 years. So we get this child permanency. And if they're in care, 12 of the most recent 24 months, then we think reunification isn't gonna happen, so then we look at these options. Okay, I can go over that with the rest of the group, if you're wondering, that might be helpful too.
Some break.
Before we get started,
Yeah,
Be in the
but
poppy
we
line
were
of dairy.
cooked till late. I got to midnight. I'm just been weary for weeks. Hopefully.
So do you have in the near future an opportunity?
Not till February. I have 3 trips scheduled. Actually, I'm gonna try after Christmas stuff again.
Yeah.
After a week, I have to stop at my mother's, both in and out. I'm always under my schedule. Concept of relaxation. Just emotional. I should have had me to do that. It's like bottomless pit that went into. I feel terrible for her.
I grabbed it because my pocket.
How much did you get? 2 on nothing and then 1. But I bet I'm more.
My bigger bag. My shoulder had started hurting, so I was just like, okay.
I loaded it up.
Yeah, then I have my work bag. That's the problem.
Yeah, just make it online.
Once I got past the diaper bag phase, I was like,
Yeah.
delete the extra. Yeah.
We're going to, you're gonna go to the Regional Training Center here in Columbus.
Is it far from
No, it's not far, it's very close. And we'll spend the afternoon there, and then from there, you'll come to Judy's.
Okay.
From there.
Is there any chance that we pass by Micro Center?
A what?
Micro Center?
Micro Center?
From here it is about 13 miles.
Dot, you want Micro Center specifically because Best Buy also has computers.
Yeah, this one
Micro
is
Center is better, yeah.
refurbished.
Cheaper.
Micro Center is
It's
what?
better. They have
Better.
more
And
and
cheaper.
better, yeah.
It's way far north.
Really? It's about 13 miles.
It's on
from
Bethel Road.
here. Okay.
You might
We
go
don't
after
have-
dinner. No, they're open till 9, so maybe somebody can run up there after dinner.
From here it is 16 minutes. Otherwise we can also do it. So, and just need to buy one for our office.
No, that's fine. I'm saying there's, we'll be done. I'm sure well,
Yeah.
we'll figure it out. Just keep it on our radar.
Okay.
And we can swing by there if we leave early enough.
Go home. Yeah.
Or I can take him at some point because I need to go there. Okay. Sometime before Christmas.
And just, I won't be able to come.
Are you going
This was my
to
work,
the
my
RTC?
husband's work schedule. and
Are you
it's
going to
fun.
the RTC? They want you to feel left
Yeah,
out.
I want to offer.
What if
Yeah.
you ran up there
I got
right after the
kiddos,
RTC?
yeah.
We'll be preparing dinner for them.
Yeah.
Would that
Okay.
work? Would that work, Lana?
But we'll be done at the RTC at 4:30.
Yeah.
I'm afraid it's gonna be a lot of traffic.
Okay.
Or
I mean, I'm just,
Okay.
Because I will need to pick my child from school
The fever itch is so.
sometime before 6.
Okay, well, we'll look at, the other option is to swing by there on our way back
Yeah.
to Dayton.
Not exactly
Can do it
swinging
on-
by.
Yeah, I'm coming to Columbus.
You are.
So, yeah, so I can arrange.
Run there on
Yes.
Saturday.
Yes.
Okay, well, let's look to see if anything does open up, or we can go this afternoon, if not, that's fine. Does anyone else want to go to Micro Center, is anyone else?
I advise, like,
You
for those
advise
who
them to
want,
go?
yeah, for those who want
Luda
to
might
pick
want.
electronics,
Oh,
I think that's the best place. Micro Center.
Well,
Best-
Micro
They
Center-
usually have these
Micro
refurbished
Center is better, it's
products.
cheaper and
and it's cheap. Refurbished. For instance, I just identify like a laptop with 60 gig RAM and 2 terabyte, 400 something.
Oh, and any guarantee?
I'm been buying from Micro Center for almost all our laptops in the office. Whenever, one of us come, we will just buy.
And it's working properly.
Yes.
I buy from there.
We'd like to go out there and
It's
see.
cheaper.
So it looks like there's, why don't you go to Micro Center after the Regional Training Center? Yes, there will be traffic. And then come later and go home.
I'm going to, be sending Lynn up there.
With method group. Well, you don't have to because that's what Micro Center, I did a lot of stuff last night.
They want people to get by.
And one another training.
They're there.
How many dishes are you expecting from native members?
Not, there's so much food, just a taste. I thought we were gonna get bread.
Everything is
Yeah.
sharing. They put
Yeah.
in there.
That's fine. Let's get that.
Well, it happened to me.
Oh, no, we don't know, but
If you want to get something else.
actually that Ambe has some Ethiopian friends here.
Yeah, okay.
And they were willing actually to
Whatever you want to do. Yeah, taste,
And you take care.
Place. You have a GPS?
That's a good story.
They have a
Yes.
GPS?
I think so.
Well, here,
No,
we
I
tell
was
them
looking,
this.
my other screen with
Cherry
the
blossom.
She was putting it in. Okay. Now, what happens?
Guardem onde?
You need to send it to our Sarah?
When you're leaving and if you want to give some permission,
It doesn't make sense. We have so much food, we're gonna have dinner tomorrow night too, because we're gonna have all the leftovers.
He's planning to order veggie combo.
Okay.
And is there any interest like in beef?
Oh, I would like that.
Anything you would like to share.
But I would just.
At what time do you tell them?
Mm,
Yeah.
So Ruby, are you gonna go? What time should we also give us?
Oh, is it? Really? Okay. You were a girl who shocked me. I told that Karen.
She said, well, she gets there before everybody gets back, she gets her.
Entirely. What to say is law for us.
Sure, I think, is everybody back in the room? Are we missing anybody?
That we need.
Maybe Sue?
So,
Okay, so we were just talking at the break, we're only on bullet 2 of our agenda. And we're here to talk about training. We're talking, but it's hard to talk about systems change and training as a change agent if you don't talk about the system. So I appreciate those conversations, and we want to talk a little bit more how our system works. But because we have such limited time, we really do want to keep, if we can, bringing it back to training. How does that impact training, and what are we doing to impact practice through training strategies? So I did, though, as I say, we're not going to talk about systems. I did want to do this visual because I'll bring this up here. I just kind of did it quickly with Sean at the break, but I thought maybe it would be something that would be helpful for you all to understand too. So when we talk about our goals in child welfare, safety, well-being, and permanency. So we start with safety, right? We talked about the risk assessment, safety assessment. We're always thinking about safety, and we're including what we would call emotional or safety. Emotional safety. Felt safety. Physical safety, but also that, because you can be safe and still not feel safe, right? So safety includes that physical safety. We put them in a safe place, but we've also provided support and time and nurturing so that they feel safe. So when we talk about the system and how foster care, adoption, and kinship care relates to the system as a whole, there is a child that is at some point identified, typically through a community member or a family member or someone calling children's services and saying, you really need to look into this child's life. I think there's some abuse or neglect happening. So caseworkers, child welfare workers will go out and check on that child.
if they do their safety assessment and they see that it's not safe for that child to remain at home, they will create what's called a safety plan, and that safety plan is placement out of the home. So foster care in this sense, or kinship care, is part of that child's safety plan. So remember, we said it's temporary. It's a safety plan until it's safe for that child to return home. So when we're looking at where is this out-of-home placement going to be, we look at least restrictive, and I should have said also best interest, but least restrictive. So that would be our kinship families, our relatives, families that are connected to that child through adoption. So that would be the least restrictive. Or that child might look at foster care if kinship care isn't available. If kinship care and foster care can't meet that child's needs, then that child would go into what we call congregate care, residential. It would be like an orphanage, but a place where it's not like a family, it's more institutionalized, or more, it's not as family-like as a foster home. And this is all temporary. All of those three options are considered temporary options, temporary choices, while the family is working on what we call their case plan. So their caseworker is saying, okay, you have some problems going on, so it's not safe for your child to be in your home. Here are some things that we think you need to do in order to get your children returned to you. If you need parenting classes, or you need substance abuse treatment, or you need mental health counseling, you need job training so that you can secure a job and have a place to live. Whatever it is for that family, they'll be working toward that case plan. And so the goal is reunification. And reunification is just one of the permanency options that there are.
And I just want to add, I don't know if this is where you were going, but you're fine. The important thing about the case plan is that it's not just they're checking off boxes that I went to drug counseling, I went to parenting classes, but that you're actually seeing a behavioral change in the parent from where they were to where we would like them to be. It doesn't have to be 100%, but we need to see a behavioral change. So they can go to parenting classes and still parent the way that they used to. So looking for that behavioral change, right?
Yeah, so the goal, so all of these were temporary options for that child while the family's working on their case plan, sorry. But the ultimate goal is permanency. And we talked about relational permanency is those relationships, but also legal permanency is legally where are they going to have benefit from, where are they going to be in a home permanently beyond 18, but where legally, so they have inheritance rights, they have a family they can rely on. So some of those legal things. So the first reunification, sometimes we don't think about that as a permanency option, but for at least for our children, for kids coming into care, our 16,000 children.
Suddenly.
Hey, heading north is good. That sounds up and positive. So reunification is most likely they're going to be the permanency option for most of the kids in our foster care system, because it's a temporary placement. Families get together what they need to get together to be able to provide, and that child is reunified. So that is a permanency option. Another permanency option is relative or kinship placement. So they might be here in their kinship placement, but it's considered temporary. But then that kin placement decides, I'm going to take legal custody of that child, or I'd actually like to adopt that child. So this could be another permanency option, least restrictive. And then adoption from when I say unknown family that they don't have a relationship with. Maybe they found through recruitment efforts, but they didn't have a relationship with. So these are all permanency options. But you can see, foster care is not over here under permanency options. Foster care is over here under temporary. Can kind of span, and you see adoption isn't over here temporary. Adoption is over here as a permanency option. Sean also asked about timeframes. I mean, it varies. So for our system, the goal is to get that child to permanency with around 2 years. And another time frame on that is if a child is in foster care or in kinship placement, is not in the home for 12 of the most recent 24 months, then it's considered that reunification is not an option. And so we look at relative or kin placement or adoption for that child. So legally that child is free for adoption or goes to a relative or legal custody.
Just a terminology question.
Yeah,
When you're talking about reunification, you're talking only when the kid goes back to the mother or father?
Yes, or no.
So
it goes
if
back
it
to the
goes
family
to-
where they were.
If it goes to a grandmother or an aunt,
That
then
would
it's
be-
relative.
Yeah, unless that's where they were living. So when I say reunification, it's reunification with back where they were.
Okay.
Yeah, back, and whoever is the family that's working on that case plan. So if they were living with grandma for 10 years and then grandma had substance abuse issues and the children had to come out of the home, grandma's home, reunification would be with grandma. Yeah. So we just wanted to go through that just so you could kind of have that process, that thought process of how a case moves through. And so when we're training our foster families, our kinship caregivers, we're training their role as a temporary stop, as a temporary care provider with typically that goal is to work towards reunification.
What is 12?
Well, 24 months is the goal to get to permanency
Okay.
for the children. The 12 of the 24 is when we kind of decide that reunification isn't an option.
Yeah.
So if it's been a year, it's been 2 years and the child is still in care in the most recent 20, kind of a weird, I don't know how they came up with that, but it's 12 of the most recent 24 months. If a child has been in care for 12 of the most recent 24 months, so within the last 2 years, then reunification is no longer considered an option and the agency goes to the court to get that child legally free. So that they
Kelly, can I clarify? It doesn't mean we wait for 24 months.
Yeah,
It means that's the longest time because of the child's sense of time. 2 years is an eternity. But as soon as we realize that the child cannot be safely reunited, we would start
absolutely.
implementing permanency.
Yeah, and in particular, if there's history of previous children being removed from the home, that can change that timeframe as well.
Questions over here?
Yeah.
Is it a way that you limit this period of time? Because, for example, in Romania, the average time spent for a child in temporary is 7.5 years. That's the average. Sometimes they are staying temporary until they are 18. Is it a way that you limit the time that they can be?
The goal is to get to a permanent placement within 2 years.
We have a federal law that requires that.
Right. So we do have kids that linger in care, but that's because there's lots of reasons that might happen, but the norm is that the goal is to get to permanency within 24 years. So get the child back home, get the child in an adoptive placement or in a legal custody with family member.
The 2 years is not necessarily our average, but that's the goal. I don't know, do you know what our average is?
Probably the average is lower. Probably the average is.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
for kids, yeah, I think it might be in there. I feel like it's not even quite a year for most kids that they're in care. And that, that's gonna vary between what their needs are, but most of our children go home and most of them go home in less than a year.
For us, the average is 7.5 years.
Yeah, this says, I'm sorry, these are Ohio numbers and I'll send this out to you guys. The average, there's 76% of our kids that are in care go home or are in custody for 2 years. So they're in care for, I'm sorry, under 2 years. Sorry, but yeah, 76% is under 2 years.
So do you say permanent when they now legal, right?
Right. We're talking about when we say permanency, we're talking about legal permanency.
Okay.
Right. So a family has gone to court to adopt the child, or a relative has gone to court to get legal custody of the child.
Or custody is given back to the primary family.
In the field guide, it talks about some dynamics of adoption that are different from dynamics of foster care that are related to a family feeling entitled and the child feeling like they are there forever. And the legal permanence is a sign that this is meant to be forever rather than it's temporary. And the other piece is that the reason that they passed the law originally, this was 20 some years ago, maybe more, where they did the limit of 2 years. It came along with something called reasonable efforts. And it was an intent to prevent agencies from keeping children in temporary care forever. And the law requires all child welfare organizations throughout the country to make reasonable efforts. It's not clearly defined, but the term reasonable is important. Reasonable efforts to reunite that child with their family within that time frame. And if it can't be done, you go for permanent, some other alternative permanent placement. So this is something you might want to advocate for, Alex, if the average is 7, because that's not in a child's best interest.
Yes, but now we have the law says that in between a year.
So you've got the law, but
Yeah.
it's not being enforced or
It's,
implemented.
yeah, nobody applies.
Well, but I think the way the federal government enforces is through financial sanctions. The agencies lose money if they don't meet the numbers. And so, but it's another issue is how do you don't have something like that, how do you enforce it?
And we did have, those children that are what we consider lingering in foster care that have been there longer than 24 months, because sometimes it's the parent seems to get it together and then they fall apart. And so it's like, they're so close to getting it together, we don't want to completely sever their ties, but that's where child-specific recruitment would come in. And we really work very specifically with that child, with that family, and Sarah mentioned concurrent planning to try to, because the goal is permanency. Because 7 years, those kids are probably aging out, right?
Yes.
7.
Yes.
And so they have.
Many of them, will be kicked out of the system.
Right. We ask our foster family when we're talking about independent living and aging out, how many of we ask the participants in the room, how many of you all relied on your parents after the age of 18? How many got maybe some money, maybe got a place to live, and pretty much everybody in the room will say that they leaned on their family in some way, up to probably until their mid-20s, or maybe some of them are still leaning on their family. In different ways, but we know, 18 didn't work for us, and we haven't had the trauma that these kids have had. Another thing to think about is an 18-year-old who's typically developed is very different from an 18-year-old who's had multiple traumas, who's had developmental delays because of that trauma. So when we say they're chronologically 18, they may not be there emotionally or mentally or cognitively.
In one city in Brazil, they changed the local law. So now the kids can stay up to 24 years old. I think that's
We have a program, they don't get to stay in the same placement necessarily. Sometimes they have to move or they move on their own, but we do have a program where they can bridge it. They can stay on until 21 though. But it did extend it a little bit beyond 18. There's a record. I think a lot of the trauma training that we're learning as we're doing, one of the residual effects is that we know so much more about how the brain develops and how long it takes for the brain to develop. And we know that the typical brain isn't developed until late 20s, and that's again somebody that hasn't had any trauma, who has been developing typically. So we know these kids are really delayed quite often for their trauma.
Kelly, I have a question, and it may not be something we want to discuss, but looking at 30 days from the family in Ohio, is it something that we should maybe mention?
Do you know the sorry, I was just going to tell you the history of it, and then Sarah can jump in on the current. But 30 Days to Family comes from Kevin Campbell, and Kevin Campbell had, I guess maybe 10 years ago, maybe not quite that long, he created this model called family finding. But where his model came from is the Red Cross refugee search for families. So he's actually, what we're doing in child welfare now is really based on a model that the Red Cross has for displaced children because of war. So it's it's kind of interesting how that's happened and how that might play into some of your countries. But family finding is based on that. We need quick response quickly to find families. So let's hear.
So 30 Days to Family is when a child comes in to care, there are specialists that will take those cases and try to find as many familial or kin connections as they can. Because I think, I forget what the average number of connections that people were saying that they can find. They're saying that they want to find, I think it's around at least 60 connections to kin. That's, again, family or outside the family, but that has a bond with the child within 30 days of placement, so that they have different options to explore. That maybe if primary family isn't willing to give names and locations of their family members for various reasons, this specialist can look at all of the potential people out there. And again, it could be for placement or it could just be for connection. But they have had cases where they have been able to find like 250 connections within 30 days for one child. They do like genograms and they build it all the way out. And they're mining the internet. They're cold calling people saying, hey, I heard your name, that you were connected to this child, what's your connection? Again, in hopes of taking what we're doing a little bit better at the back end for those kids that are lingering and moving it to the front end so that they don't have to be in, or so that they can be in kinship care rather than foster care, so that they can maintain those connections with their families and have that identity and history and the connection to their culture and their roots. So that's kind of the easy, basic piece of 30 days to family. A challenge with that, I will say, is what I recently heard from a worker that's doing 30 days to family. They have 30 days. Once that 30 days is up, they're no longer on the case. So they give that information to the ongoing worker or the worker that's working with the family. And I've heard that unfortunately, a lot of that information is just then sitting in a drawer. It's not because of time constraints or workloads or multiple things. I don't know that the worker doesn't want to do something with it. But that's a challenge I think that they'll have to look at as they move forward with the program. Because there's only 8 sites. Yeah, it's very few within, like, again, we have 88 counties in Ohio, and there's only 8 sites currently. And those specialists are taking the cases that are the hardest to find connections. But they are finding the connection and finding many and multiple. So I'm hopeful that that will continue.
I don't know, how this would translate, but obituaries that are published in our papers, they always list surviving family members. So obituaries are a very easy place to find family members. If there's family cemeteries where the majority of the family, you can read the tombstones.
There's websites that will do that for you, search it for you.
There's sometimes family Bibles, sometimes the matriarch or the patriarch of the family will have a family Bible that lists the genealogy in front.
And again, asking the kids.
Oh yeah.
The kids, sometimes the kids are overlooked in that search by the caseworkers, but directly asking the kids, who's in your family, as far out as they can go, and making those connections.
Is it considered just because they're family, or do they need to have a connection first? Because sometimes.
Well, I think what they do first is they find all the possible connections, and then I think they try to work from closest to further out. But I believe they do call the family members and say, how are you connected? Are you aware of? And sometimes it's a very distant relative if they're related. But they will, I think, go in that route because of the blood relation. They won't do that with fictive kin or non-related people. But they will go further out in the genogram or in the connection tree to potentially people that don't have a one-to-one connection, but they're aware of the child. But I think they vet those fairly closely.
There's still that historical, this person may not have a connection directly to that child, but they have a family history, they have a family culture.
Or they may look like them or share different characteristics. Those pieces where they have pictures, or they can get pictures much easier of different family members than a foster care person.
But they have 30 days.
The worker has 30 days to come up with all of these connections and potential placements.
This is just one model. I mean, there are multiple models out there of ways to do what they call family finding and family search engagement. So 30 days of family is just one now that's being funded here in Ohio. The current one that's just been rolled out. So we wanted to talk briefly before we get into what we're training as to who, and we have these circles up here. So we could each, from our perspective, talk a little bit about what we mean by staff and just kind of define that. But for foster care system, for us, there is usually a foster care worker who's working with the foster family. So when we say staff, we would include that those workers who are working with the family, who are doing the assessment, approving the family, and then providing support to the family. And I think in an ideal system, that foster family has that support worker. Sometimes they call them resource workers, but you've got that, and that's separate from the worker who's working with a child and family on the case plan, because sometimes there might be issues where that foster family needs support. So they need somebody that's just looking out for their best interest. So when I talk from the foster care perspective, talking about staff, it's both the workers who are working with the children and families, but also the worker who is working with that foster family.
So mine has kind of bifurcated topic or area too. So if they're licensed PIN, so if it's a family member or fictive PIN that becomes licensed, they're a part of the foster care system then. So they would get those workers that she just talked about. If they are not licensed, which many of our PIN are not licensed, then they basically, depends on where they live, they could either have just the worker that's working with the primary family, and the caseworker is working with them as the placement option. So they may not be getting lots of supports or lots of resources, partly because there aren't a lot out there for PIN. But then in some counties, there are actual kinship workers. So like the foster care workers, the kinship worker would be working directly with that kinship family, providing resources, seeing how they're doing, following up with them, plus having the worker that is working with the primary family involved as well. Maybe complicated area.
And mine is even a little more complicated. Strictly, there sometimes is just an adoption worker, so that's the person working with the child, but then they also work with the family to prepare the family. And then we have this assessor training, which trains those foster care workers and then adoption workers.
So it's all kind of can be very interwoven.
So we're just, I guess, trying to show that when you're talking, think broadly when you're thinking about who are my staff and who are the people that I need to support. So there's a lot of, I think in your case, you're using a lot of volunteers, but a lot of different roles and tasks that those people will play. It's not, and they will need different training based on what their tasks and responsibilities are.
And I will add also with that is the supervisors. The supervisors need to know what their workers need to know. I think sometimes that's a missing part with kinship. It needs to come from the top down. Well, both ways really, but just throwing that in there. Don't forget the supervisors.
Yes, absolutely. So when we talk about, we use a generic term, resource families. We say that because we mean the adopted family, the kinship family, the respite care family, the foster family. So we're also talking about all of those families too, in terms of our resource families. So again, their different roles mean they need different training, they have different tasks to do, so they have different skills and knowledge that they need to do those tasks. That's fun. And then we have primary families. So in our system, we don't do a lot of training for the primary family. Again, it's funding. There's not really a source of funding, but when we talk about preventive services, it would be nice to be able to, because imagine that we took our families through this pre-service training, our primary parents, and we didn't just give the training to the foster family after the child's been removed, but what if we gave that training to those primary parents? Maybe the child wouldn't have to go into foster care. So thinking about what are some of this training that you could do for your primary parents in a preventive way.
Or even if they are in care, having the primary parents go through that, kind of, I guess similar to a parenting class, but a little more in depth in a parenting class, with the trauma, understanding trauma, because I'm sure they have their own trauma, but how that might actually help reunification and that reunification being permanent. Because we see a lot of kids bounce in and out, back to parent, back in, back to parent, back in. So having that foundational piece would be fabulous as well for the primary families.
But when we're talking about the Camp family, do they have to go into training?
Good question. So in Ohio, we do not train our kinship families unless they're going to become licensed. Unless they're going to go for licensure. They would become a foster.
Yeah, they can choose.
They can choose.
Whether, in most cases, whether they want to become foster families and have access to those funds and those supports, or whether they don't want to come into the system and just be a kin.
Nationally, though, I would say a lot of states require their kin to become licensed. So they will get that training, and the supports that come along with being licensed. So they'll get training, they'll get financial assistance for the children, all of that. So, but in Ohio, we currently are not training kinship providers, or caregivers. But I'm hoping that changes. So, because they're taking the same children, so they need the same. It's not enough. Love is not enough, and family is not enough. Just because I know my niece and nephew doesn't mean I know everything that they might need. So I'm advocating for that piece.
Is the number of kinship family that are not trained and give up on the kids high?
We don't have those numbers. I have heard anecdotally that it's not a high number, but what happens sometimes is the kids will be placed with family in the primary at like 8, 9 years old, and they do really well for a while, and then they hit those teenage years, and then they're skipping foster care and going right into the residential because the families can't handle them. But for me, my question is that because of trauma-related issues in the family and they weren't addressed? So then the trauma is now coming to a head in those teenage years, and the family just is not equipped because they thought they were doing well. So I think a lot of the training should be there for that, to help with those disruptions.
This training immediately age ready, but the training you have
For foster families?
Yeah.
So it's pre-service is foundational training, so everybody comes to 36 hours. Now we do have some of our, and we're public systems, so our private system, our private agencies are typically the agencies that take the kids with developmental disabilities or high emotional needs, a lot of trauma. And so they are required to provide additional training above 36 hours. They will typically provide training specific to the needs. So I think we talked about that developmental disability. So that's the group that typically takes those children, and they will provide that foundational training, but also very specific training based on the needs of those children.
So for parents, it's like this.
36 hours for yes.
Well, I guess the question is, the home study, the assessment, is it the training or the training?
So typically, I would say ideally, we would like to see training as part of the assessment process, because we talked about our dropout rate, and so training helps self-assessment, but also a lot of times workers will sit in, they're not doing the training, but they'll sit and watch the people that are in the training, watch the participants and see how they respond, and they're looking for do they seem to be understanding? Are they are they embracing these philosophical differences, or are they resistant to change? Are they talking about corporal punishment? Are they talking about severing all ties with the family? So we use the training as part of the assessment process, but along with training, there are interviews with the family, there are reference letters, there are doctors' letters. We look at their finances. They have to submit. It's very in-depth assessment process. So training is just one piece of the assessment process, and so all of that is kind of happening at the same time. Usually, training starts it. So usually, training happens first because essentially, if they're going to fall out because of training, we don't want to have to put a lot of hours of work with them, and then they drop out. So we get them through training first, so we lose that 40% that say this isn't for me, and we know who to give our time and efforts to.
I just sometimes they rely on the trainers to give that feedback too. What they're seeing in class, what is the participant saying and doing? They don't always go to every training and be present.
And I think there's that, something to think about as you're building your training system. We want that classroom to be a safe space, right? We want people to be able to share and to say what they're thinking and to discuss, because that's how you change mindset, is because you share, you hear from other people, you see different perspectives. So we don't want that to become a place where they are fearful to say what they say because they're afraid that they're going to get kicked out, or they're not going to get to continue with the process. So it's a balancing act that you have to do, where you can use this training as an assessment piece, but you also need to remember that this should be a safe space, and that discussion, just because that person said this thing that makes you raise your eyebrows doesn't mean that they can't, with additional training and additional discussion, be perfectly appropriate.
And a lot of families, at least in my experience, go into training and change their viewpoint because, oh, now it makes sense. Oh, they've been traumatized. All right. Well, not all these families are bad. Sure, we'll work with this first family. So it's change the narrow.
So the last group that we wanted to briefly talk about is the child themselves, and I think Jeff might have brought that up. But again, because of funding, the way that funding is structured here in Ohio, we don't have the opportunity to train the children in care the way that we would like to. But they absolutely need preparation, and I think we do a better job preparing them for permanency when it's adoption. We don't do a lot of preparation when they're going into foster care, but we do have resources. It's not training, but we have resources. They have a foster care rights manual that and actually alumni of the foster care system, which are the group that we identify as they were foster care children, and they've either been adopted or aged out of care, and so now they're adults, but they experienced foster care. We call them foster care alumni, and they are very vocal here in Ohio, and they are the ones that push to get this rights book too. And so it's required every single child that comes into care gets a physical copy of their rights, and tells them what their rights are in foster care, and who to talk to if there's issues or problems. So it's not training, but it is some support, regardless of age. So obviously, I mean, they're not going to be able to read the manual if they're younger, but it's a requirement that they all get that, and doing going over in an age appropriate way. So ideally, they shouldn't just get the manual, but ideally, the foster parent is going over the manual, or the caseworker is going over the manual, and doing some one-on-one. I guess you consider that training or education.
Can you give us some of the topics or concepts that
Yeah, so
we approach it?
one of the big ones did you ask about the rights book or the service?
No, when you train
Train children.
Yeah.
So one of the big ones is like diversity issues, or do I have a right to continue to attend the church that I've been attending? Do I have a right to learn to drive a car for older kids? Do I have a right to go over to my friend's house if I want to go down the street and play with my friends? So some of those topics, but diversity and including of I just being able to maintain. So we have we have a focus right now on our LGBTQ, which are lesbian, gay, bisexual. So there's a section in that manual for what are your rights to be able to be supported in who you are and express who you are, and what are the responsibilities of foster parents to allow that. What about if I have to go to court? How do I prepare for court? What am I supposed to say to court? How do I act in front of a judge? Those kinds of things. Other topics that would be sibling issues, like what do I do if I think that my foster parents are treating their birth children different than they're treating me? Who do I go to talk to about that?
Child participation in the system, in different ways.
It is. I think it is. I think because of our alumni, because our former foster care youth that are now adults are coming back and saying, we need to be doing this, we need to be listening to us, we need to be telling the children what's going on. So I think gradually we're seeing some systems change because they're pushing so that we understand more to include these boys.
And I think outside of training, some of the alumni are able to sit in on different meetings or initiative meetings that we have so that they have the youth perspective as well, not just the professional perspective, so that they're bringing their view into initiatives, different things that they're rolling out throughout the state. So that has been very helpful as well.
And we have alumni as trainers. So we use them as trainers, so they'll go in and train foster parents on how to work with youth.
I think with this child right, I mean, I think this is Europe. I think if you talk about participation, you need to make sure that you have the right level of communication with the child instead of
Yes, absolutely.
So is there a thought into that? You don't have to make a solution, just thinking.
Right, and I think that's encouraged, and I think it's implied in training, but I think you make a good point because I don't know that we do enough to educate our workers and our foster parents on child development and how to communicate at an age appropriate level. But that would be the goal, absolutely, is to do that in ways that the child doesn't understand. And even sometimes they won't want to come to a meeting. Maybe they don't want to come to a case planning meeting, but finding ways where is there somebody that you can talk to that you feel comfortable with, where you can share your feelings, and then they can come to the meeting and represent you. Or would you like to write a letter to the judge and share that with the judge, or draw a picture, how you're feeling. So there are those kinds of ways too. But I do think, that's a place where we could probably opportunity for growth in our system for sure.
Kelly? I just want to do a time check for you guys. Because we go to lunch at 1 or a few minutes after, and we have to leave here at 2 to go out to the RTC. This is rich discussion, and obviously everybody around the table is participating, so it's something that needs to be talked about. But if there's anything that you feel that you need to get said now, and there can always be follow-up on Skype. I've told everybody that this isn't the last time they'll ever see us. We can do some of the rest of this in other ways after. But you've got about a half hour to 40 minutes to nail what you want to nail.
Yeah, so I think we can talk about specifically what we train and why we train it. We can move into that, which is our.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I just want to mention, I think maybe just touch on this, is that there's a few good books that I think are being developed in South Africa that are sort of read like stories for kids that inform them of their rights and responsibilities. So maybe that methodology can be introduced to make sure that you communicate the level of the child and not just hand them a policy document.
Right.
They can only read at 21 and understand it.
Our document is written by our foster care alumni, so it is not jargony at all. They really do, but it is true that you don't get older child still. But it is written by our alumni. And something else I was going to say, but I don't know. I will. They'll come back. So we talked about who to train. So when we talk about training, we have to get it right. And I know you guys talked about this before, but there's a lot of liability in not getting it right. So as a system, especially when you're trying to start a foster care program, a kinship care program, if you don't get that training right, then that system isn't going to work, and then you're not going to have the buy-in and the funding that you need to grow that system, right? So at a system level, there's liabilities. At an agency level, if you're not training the family, you're not training the workers appropriately, then you as an agency aren't going to get your volunteers that you need. You're not going to get the funding that you need. So, training is pretty much a linchpin for both of those issues. And fundamentally, what we're all concerned about is the children and families, right? So if we don't get it right with training, if we don't prepare those families right, if we don't prepare those workers to work with those families, then that we run the risk of that placement failing. We run the risk of that relationship failing, which means that we're creating trauma. We're all in this to prevent further trauma from these kids. But if we don't get training right, if we don't do preparation right, then we're creating more trauma for these kids. This is not what we want to do. That is not what we intended. So preparation and training is, it's critical to moving our systems forward with whatever goal that might be. So when we think about training and what do our workers need, I think you guys talked about competency-based training. So you talked about competency are those skills and those bits of knowledge that someone needs to be able to do their job tasks. And we talked a little bit about all the different job tasks that someone might have in our system. So the goal is to kind of map it out when you're thinking about training. We do have some funders that think, well, hey, people need to know about trauma. Let's hold a trauma training. But if you haven't adequately prepared those participants to understand child development, to understand brain development, to understand behavior and emotion, then they don't have anything to hang that trauma training on. So it's not gonna take. It's just so. We want to hurry up and get to the meat of, what it is, what are the problems, but we've got to take that step back and take that time to build that foundation. And that's really what our pre-service is. We talked about pre-service as an assessment piece, but it's also building that foundation. So it's, so when you ask if we train on child developmental disabilities and pre-service, we aren't saying the word developmental disabilities in pre-service, but we are training what does typical development look like, so that when you see something that, so you'll be able to see those red flags and recognize when there might be an issue. And then later on, you're going to get more training on specific child development, or developmental disabilities. So do we say the word, do we talk about child developmental disabilities? No, but are we laying that foundational piece of information so that people can understand what is meant by developmental disabilities? Yes. So I'm just going to run through, I think because of time, I kind of run through what pre-service looks like. And I think you guys have been doing a version of this pre-service or have seen, is that right?
No, not everyone here.
Not everyone, okay,
Not
sorry.
everyone here. They've seen the manuals, the IHS manuals,
Okay.
but they haven't, not everybody.
So what, if you've seen it, it's probably slightly different because ours is very Ohio focused and we just revised it in 2015. So
And that's what they
that's what they have, the 2015. Okay, so just the Ohio specific stuff is probably, yeah. So basically they're coming to class in that day one to get an overview. And each of these modules, these 12 modules are 3 hours long and they're all provided in class. 3 hours in class. Now, when these are offered, they're offered in very different ways. Ideally, we would like to see these spread out, these modules spread out so that they have time in between taking each class to really let it sink in and understand. So ideally, they would be coming maybe twice a week, 3 times a week to get these trainings for 3 or 4 weeks until they get through all 12 modules. Some agencies, in an effort to speed up that process, will offer these modules 3 on Friday, 3 on Saturday, 3 on Sunday, and then next week. Yeah. Exactly. Right. That's what we do when we hear that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's cognitive overload, to use a scientific term, but if you're getting this information too quickly, you don't have time to take it from your short-term memory and process it into your long-term memory. So it just
Where you're not even taking it in by the
Yeah.
third one on the first
Yeah,
day.
you just lose it. So, that's another, when we talk about, I don't think we're gonna get there, but logistics and practical considerations is how you've got the pressures of getting these people through training quickly. Maybe they're traveling really far. I mean, that's why we're doing 5 days in a row with you guys, because they're traveling really far. But, ideally, it would have been nice if we would have had a day, a couple days break, another day of training, so that you had time to digest all of this information. At least you got to sleep, and process it in your sleep a little bit. So, but think about what how you're delivering the training, how quickly they get that. So they get that basic overview, and sometimes we lose people right after the first session when they hear about the overview. And then we have a training on teaming. So who is the child welfare team, and what is their role on the child welfare team? And so right at the beginning, this is where we stress that most children in our system are being reunified with their family. So it's the caregiver's responsibility to work with that family. So we expect that they have visits with the family, that they include that family. Maybe that child has a concert, a musical concert at school. We would encourage them to invite that primary family to come to that. Or if the child has a doctor's appointment, invite your primary parent to come to that. So we really, from the very beginning, push that reunification is typically the goal, and they need to not just be working with the child, but working with the family. We have child development. So our child development, you could do a year of training on child development and still not get everything. So we had a real hard time figuring out in 3 hours what is the focus. So what we went with is we really focus on social development, because social and emotional development, because we think that's where foster parents can have the biggest impact. And that's where trauma is having the biggest impact on children. So we were thinking strategically, okay, we really want them to understand trauma. So what about child development relates to trauma? So that when we get there, we're building that foundation. So we talk a lot about self-control, which we call self-regulation. So we talk about attachment, and we talk about initiative, being able to take control and do things on your own. So that's where we focus. And even though so sometimes we'll get foster families that come into training and they say, I don't want a little child, I want a teenager. So why do I need to know about early childhood development if I want a teenager? So our class is again, we're talking about foundation. So yes, you're getting a teenager, but that teenager was once a little child. And did they get their self-regulation skills? Did they have strong attachments as a small child? Were they able to not have so much fear that they weren't able, they were able to take some risk and go out and get some things done for themselves and be proud of themselves because they had that confidence and that relationship that someone's going to support them if they fail. Oh, Sarah.
Sorry, I didn't get, what do you teach them when you're talking about teaming?
We talk about what their role is on the team. So how do they work with the caseworker? How do they work with, and a lot of focus on working with the primary parent in reunification, but what their role is. We talk to them about their temporary, and we're working towards permanency, and they may not be the permanency option. In most cases, the family of origin. Yeah. So, but other teaming issues like going to court, sometimes they have to go to court. We don't talk a lot about that, but how to communicate with their caseworker, how to communicate with the school, how to be an advocate. So all of those topics. So then after we've talked about child development and what the foundational piece is in child development, then we talk about the impact of trauma. Once they understand typical child development, then they can start to understand what we mean by trauma and how that impacts. So we talk about what is a trauma, because I think we talked about this in here, but if you have lived your life in trauma, sometimes you don't even recognize it as trauma. It's just your life. It's just normal. And so we've even got foster parents who have had that life of trauma and don't recognize that they're having trauma. And I'm going to put a pin in it, but I want somebody to remind me if we have time, because we know that our participants are going to have trauma of their own. We have to set up our classroom to be a trauma-informed classroom. And if I can get to that, I will. Remind you.
Oh. I don't think I am. All right. So we talk about sexual abuse because Maria and I were talking about this at the break. Not because sexual abuse has such a greater impact than emotional abuse or physical abuse, but because it is scary to our foster parents. And so we want to just put that out there right now and give them some tools and help them understand so that it's not so scary to them. But it's not because we think that has a greater impact. It's just because it's a scarier thing for our foster parents to think about. Then we talk about minimizing the trauma placement. I think I already talked about this a little bit, but every placement we consider to be trauma. So we give them some very specific thoughts or ideas about what they can do to make their home, that placement less traumatic. And when we focus on this, we're talking about like the day the child comes into their home. So what can they do in the immediate placement? And we go through it in different rooms. So what do you do when they first come in? How do you connect them to the home? So very, very practical. And I think you guys have probably our foster parents don't want to know the theory of why an airplane flies, right? They want to know how to get on the airplane, how to go somewhere. So foster parents want very, very practical information. They're not so much interested in the theory behind why it works or what, they don't want the book knowledge. They want the practical. What do I do when this child comes into my home? So this is a very practical training. We talk about diversity issues, and we take the same concept of going through the house, and the house represents different rooms, represent different issues, but we talk about diversity issues. So, who does the chores in the family, and how do you incorporate the child? Trying to think bedroom issues in terms of who sleeps where. We talk about community. We talk about diversity in the community. I'm trying to think. One of the things that we didn't mention earlier, but we'd be very happy to share summaries. I know you guys don't want paper to carry on the airplane, but if there's documents that you want, we'd be happy to put them on a flash drive and provide them to you. So we can provide you an overview of your service. But just trying to think of some of the, when we talk about managing emotion and the behavior, we have really shifted because of trauma, and we used to call this discipline, right? So you're doing it wrong, and I'm going to teach you how to do it right. And so when we started getting more trauma informed, we recognized that behavior is meaning. So in the trauma world, behavior is meaning, and it's just a way to express an emotion. So we don't think about discipline. We think about how can I teach that child to understand their emotions, understand what's going on in their body, and learn how to control or at least manage their emotions, manage their behavior. So, and then me as a caregiver, how do I manage my own emotions and my own behavior so that I'm modeling correctly and so that they're seeing what that looks like. So a very different approach to what would typically be thought of as discipline when we talk about trauma-informed care.
When we look at those managing behavior and emotion, does that speak directly to the effect of trauma and perhaps sort of built in protective factors to help with that potential?
Yes, yeah. We talk more about protective factors in number 4, the impact of trauma. I have a personal philosophy because I think trauma can be scary to people. And I think that trauma is scary, but there's so much we know about trauma and ways to help, and it's not a permanent thing. So whenever I train on trauma, I always talk about resiliency, talk about well-being, and talk about protective factors because I want people to have hope. I want them to, even especially if you're training kids who've experienced trauma and you're talking to them about how bad trauma is and how it's going to impact them, that's painful to hear, So you're also training them on have hope. There's hope. You can get help. You can get support. You don't. Your life doesn't have to be this. There is a way out.
Yeah, I'd like to resonate with you. I'm working a little bit more with at-risk students from different backgrounds, and so what I found also worked for them specifically was encouraging them with kind of growth mindset and to making aware of the fact that your brain is physically changing as you're wrestling with whatever you're doing. Very valuable.
Absolutely. So there's the term that's it's a scientific term, but
plasticity, your brain plasticity, yeah, so that the brain changes based on behavior, based on experience, absolutely. We do talk about a little bit about how being a foster parent is going to impact you. So we want them to be prepared for that. We talk about, again, a whole module on working with primary parents because that is very important, at least in our system. And then we have 2 permanency modules, child issues and permanency, so from the child's perspective, and then family issues, so from the family's perspective, how might permanency impact them. So that, again, that's a quick and dirty overview of pre-service training. But we'd be happy to share some written material on that. So I'm thinking because we're so short on time, maybe talking about the caseworker side, so assessors. So in Ohio, we have a very unique program called assessors. So in Ohio, you cannot do certain tasks unless you've received certain training. And that's what that assessor training is. So I'm going to have Amanda briefly go through that, and then maybe we'll just open it up for final questions. You have 2 minutes.
Family and child assessment, so that is that piece where we're assessing the family. We're looking at their strengths, weaknesses, for the home study, to rate that document. Child assessment, that's a bigger one, that's a little more challenging to explain, but it's such a good one. Assessing where the child's at, where the child's needs are, matching, again, that matching piece comes into play.
No, but I think documentation is really important to teach students.
No, but
so because we don't want to put, but I think when we do it, when they're writing an assessment, it's sometimes like, oh, the house is dirty, or those kinds of things. Instead of saying, I saw 10 plates that needed washed on the table. So learning how to document in a way that you're very specific about and behavioral.
As you mentioned, you are training together the kinship therapist. So how are you utilizing your training the fact that they need slightly different, right?
So I think that's a struggle for us. I think ideally we would like to train them all separately because we have separate issues, but I think for funding and for purposes, because this is foundational.
So it's not purpose.
No, it's more funding. It's more,
And I guess it's very important because obviously there are similarities, but very substantial differences in the roles.
And I think the other issue is, especially in Ohio, since kinship is not a funded population, we don't know how many people are going through as a kinship provider, because we're not asking that, so we're gonna, with some new evaluation, we're gonna be trying to capture that as well, so we can see actually what the real numbers are.
Sure.
But yeah, it's definitely, because everything is foster care driven or the language is foster care rather than caregiver. So it's either foster care or adoption rather than kinship. But yes, that's a challenge that we face.
So do they realize the differences? Because as you said, for instance, in a case of foster care, we see that the contact is the biological family is always an issue, or most of the time. For kinship care, this is a very specific issue because it's their own kin.
right.
So
Yeah,
it
so
makes
It's a very different,
working with primary parents would look very different than foster care.
Right.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
grandma's role is now mom, but
Mm.
she's still grandma.
Right.
And she's still this person's
Yeah.
mom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mom.
So the dynamic, yes, so no, we'd like to eventually get there, to be a more separate, specific for kinship, but we're waiting for that.
And here in a public sense, all of our foster families that come in that want to adopt, we license them as foster parents with adoption approval. So if all of those things don't work out, reunification with bio original family doesn't work out, then they have this adoption approval and hope that you've made that good match in the beginning, that child can stay in that foster home and now be adopted by their foster care.
I do have a question. When you have foster family, okay, that wants to adopt, okay, isn't that a problem on the unification?
Ding, ding, ding.
Yes.
That's what,
If I had a prize, I would throw it at you.
I'm sorry.
It is a lot of times we get the families that this is how they want to create their family. And that's not necessarily, how it works. It's, so we really try to piece of communication, working with the birth family, and then continuing that connection when the kids go home so that it's not another loss. They can stay involved with that family and be support for them in a different way and stay connected to that child. So I always try to drive that home with people. And then it also gives them that sense, that peace of mind that the child is still safe. I see them with their parents and they're okay and they're all doing well. The change happens. So getting them on board that way sometimes helps to work with the family. But it is because yes, you get to that point. We talked about that egocentric point of view. Well, I'm better because I can provide more services and I have more money and a better house than going home to their birth parents. So how is that in their best interest? Because sometimes the families can't. So we really hope they get the message in pre-service and then continue on through the whole foster care.
I'm sorry, I don't want to be negative here. I just want to know. We're talking about training, okay? And is there a follow-up, a proper follow-up? I mean, after the foster families, for example, they are with the kids. How long do they have meetings? Or after the adopted family already adopted the kids? Is there a program that they must do?
It depends on if they're licensed foster home and they want to continue to maintain their license, they have to renew their license every 2 years, and they're required to continue to get training. So for a family foster home, I think it's 40 hours, and then for a family, a foster home that's going to take more difficult kids with greater needs, then they have 60 hours. So there is the requirement. And did you talk about individual training assessments when you talked about competency-based training? So part of their renewal is that they actually sit down with their worker and create their training plan. So here's where I really feel like I need training. So in these next 2 years, this is my goal to get this kind of training. But if they're just adopted, they don't have that. Right? If they're an adopted family, there's no requirement. Really? It's just
Do you need some projects sometimes?
because when we get them to training on their own, when they voluntarily come to training, it's usually because they're in such a crisis.
Birth parent services, working with the birth parent oftentimes when you're working towards that reunification and then it has reunification doesn't work. So that particular course talks a lot about supporting that birth parent and how to help them deal with their own loss during the termination of their parental rights. Post finalization adoption services, what the family might need after. Again, we talked about how they're in crisis, so once they get to some of that post finalization, and you'll see the other one that I probably won't get to on some of those topics that you would want to address in post finalization. Adoption assistance. Here, our families are typically eligible for a financial subsidy after adoption. So once they're finalized, then we can send them that monthly sort of stipend payment. For typically until the child would be 18, sometimes it can be extended. There's a little review adoptive family. And it's a need kind of based on the child's needs, and there's a process on how to negotiate
Negotiate.
negotiate with the agency and the family. placement strategies. I think it kind of goes back to that minimizing trauma and how to select the best family for the child, how to actually have them get to know each other and move that process to placement. And then pre-finalization, working through those issues as they're going to finalize the adoption. So the child's in the home, what are you working on? Attachment and bonding, helping that family understand, what's going on in that child's brain and getting to that point. Because it's not, like you said, it's not love, it's not enough. It's not an initial, oh, I'm going to adopt you. We're all a big happy family now.
So I'm gonna stop her from going to tier 2 because there was a specific question about permanency roundtables and we have like 5 minutes. So that's the tier 1, they call that. So they have a year to take that training, and then they have an additional 3 years to complete the rest of the training. To be able to call themselves.
So is a specific program?
This is a specific program so the state has identified. I'm sorry. The state has identified specific tasks that if you are going to work with a birth parent, or if you are going to license a foster parent, you have to be an assessor. And to be an assessor, you have to go through this training. So it's a specific program that's
training for people who are working.
Who are right.
Field.
Yes. Yes, who will be doing right, it's a social worker themselves. Right.
So when you're talking about this, I just want to get it right. When you're talking about the assessor program, it's for social work.
Social workers, yes, who are then working with, who are doing the assessments on the family, who are working with the kids.
And that would be tier 1.
They can take up to, they have up to a year.
It's 36
What's the
hours.
minimum?
I'm not sure. I mean, we only track if they take it within a year, so I don't know how quickly they go.
But in this way, checklist for the social workers to use you.
There are some checklists involved, but also it's teaching them some critical thinking skills.
The problem with the checklist is always that some people are just
Checking the list, yeah.
anyway, and they.
It talks about this like state forms that we use, but right there, the theory, it should be, they kind of, you try to marry them so that it can be useful as explaining what's important.
So Sarah's gonna go over PRTs. I know we have 3
minutes.
minutes, and then we will be around. We're gonna, I think the 3 of us are gonna, if that's all right, we'll stick around for lunch. You guys have specific questions to follow up. We can. What, Kim, did you say that again?
Can you do a move on
What is that?
like an online video?
Oh, sure. Zoom, I got Zoom. Oh, yeah, okay. I know, yeah, so we would be happy to talk with anybody if you have specific questions. We will share, maybe we'll put it up here. We'll share our email addresses. But we're happy. Yeah, we have Zoom, we have Skype.
You can have a 3 months.
Yeah,
Yeah,
bunch of
maybe
things.
maybe.
It was when we first got together, we were like, oh, what are we gonna tell them? We have so much time. Are we gonna be able to fill the time? And now we're like, sorry, we didn't get to that. I apologize.
All right, now we're down to 2
PRT.
minutes.
Sorry.
PRT. Okay, so PRT stands for Permanency Roundtable, and I'm not sure why it falls under kinship, other than they're looking for permanency and connection and family, and to get so it's for kids that have been languishing in foster care. So they've been in foster care for a really long time, either because they say that they don't want to be adopted and they just want to age out, or they can't find a family for them, multitude of reasons why they've been in foster care for so long. So it's usually the teenagers that they're doing these permanency roundtables with. The training component for it, there's a values, a skills, and a youth-centered training, and then a caregiver training. And when an agency decides that they're going to have permanency roundtables in their agency, they almost always train their entire staff, even administrative assistants, front desk people. They train everyone because it's really a value shift within their, and a cultural change within their agency. So they will train on the values of why these are important, the skills. Not everyone always comes to the skills. That's more who's going to be involved in the permanency roundtables. And then they do the youth center because the point, or part of a large part of the permanency roundtables here in Ohio is to bring that youth voice to the table so that the youth can drive where this permanency potentially will go. And then they do have the caregiver training so that foster parents that have the children understand what the PRTs are all about. So basically, the permanency roundtable, the staff will sit and talk about the case from a fresh perspective with no blaming, no shaming of why this child has been languishing in care. But they will try to look at it as what are some possible avenues that we haven't explored. Let's do some case mining. Let's look at aunt and uncle that were in the very first initial contact but never talked to again. So they go back and try to mine the case and really have a fresh perspective on how can we reach out for this child. Then they'll bring in the youth and ask the youth, who are you connected with? Who do you remember? Where would you like to be rather than foster care? So again, bringing that youth voice to the table. They can invite support people with them. It could be their foster parent. It could be a mentor, a teacher. They try to help guide that child to understand who that supportive, what that supportive role would look like, who they would bring to the table. And then a lot of the team members will leave with homework assignments, like I'm going to reach out to Uncle Joe, or I'm going to reach out to someone else. So they'll leave with all of those and explore those options. And some of the outcomes have been that the child has been returned mom after all these years, or the child at first said that they didn't want to be adopted and they didn't understand why they were having this meeting, to having a better understanding of what permanency is and what that could mean for them, and then agreeing that, okay, I really do like my foster family, I love them, they are supportive, and yes, I would like to move towards adoption. So just moving them closer to that permanency so that they're not aging out of the system without those lifelong supports. So that's PRT I did 5 minutes, sorry. In a 5-minute nutshell. So questions?
No, we've got
You're hungry. Sarah's hungry. But I will say one more thing. That the link of the PRC, so they're doing that at the back end after the child's been in care and languishing. The 30 days to family is kind of the front door mirror of that. So they're not necessarily as maybe youth driven, because it could be the younger kids or the kids obviously that are in care, but they are in that 30 days to family, they are asking the youth, who do you have in your family or connections that you have? So they're trying to move that concept to the front end. So now we have front end and back end, and hopefully we can meet in the middle and not have kids languishing in care.
No,
So
I think
the Taurus and youth,
Center.
training, youth center training and a caregiver training in that forum, and what is that?
So there's their modules. So you have the values module, the skills module. The youth centered is for the staff, and it's to help them know how to prepare the youth for the meetings, to talk to the youth.
That everybody does.
Yes. And then the caregiver one is specifically about the values of PRTs and that is actually provided to the caregivers. And then they do have a module that I didn't mention that was for community stakeholders, judges, CASAs, GAL, I'm sorry, I'm using terms now, acronyms. So other people that would have a vested interest in understanding what they are and knowing in what avenues they could be developed.
Kelly, Jeff had a question about our group homes and institutions, residential treatment centers. Can you briefly describe
In terms of what they
whether
work
we
with.
have them?
Oh,
We do, and how they're, he asked if we had orphanages, and not technically, but we do have group homes and we do have residential treatment. Can you give read that description of
So
what
the
they are.
difference between like a foster home and a group home would be, the group home would be, people hired as staff, and they may not be there full time. They may work shifts at a group home, but a group home is still probably gonna be smaller number of children, but it's getting further away from that family-like setting. So maybe the rooms feel more like a school dorm rooms as opposed to a family home. The staff is rotating, so it's not two parents or one parent that's there all the time. It's different people that are there on different days of the week. So even though it's smaller number of children, it's getting a little bit further away from a family-like environment. And then our residential treatment centers are for typically children that just aren't able to thrive in a family-like setting. And so it's more of a almost, I don't know, like if you saw like maybe like a boarding school or dormitory kind of thing, some people might liken them to prisons. But they're depending on how there's different levels of residential. So the children living there may be able to come in and out and move more freely, but there are even some that are more like locked down facilities where it's locked. But again, the staff in a residential treatment center, the staff it's not a parent staff, it's paid staff to be there, and they're working shifts. So they might work, 10 to 12, and then another person come in overnight and a different person. So it's more, it's just both of those are getting further and further away from like a family-like setting. A lot of our residential centers have a lot of rules and a lot of regulations, lights out here, dinners at this time. So very regimented schedules too. And in our foster homes, we really don't allow corporal punishment. We don't encourage our foster parents to lay hands on children at all. In some residential centers, although they're getting away from that, it's more, it's okay to do some physical restraints with some of those kids in residential.
Physical restraint, not punishment.
No, not punishment, but physical restraint.
Hold kids down if they're having tantrums.
Right.
Typically for their own safety.
Right.
I'm not, there are always bad institutions everywhere, but the goal of our residential treatment centers, theoretically, they're supposed to be therapeutic milieu, which means that you have the therapy going on in all the daily activities, but typically the kids that go there are not able to function in a less restrictive setting. If they are, they shouldn't be there. So
And the goal is to always get them to a point where they can step back down to a family. For the residential staff, that's kind of probably an issue that's going to come up in Ohio more, because we don't train the residential staff right now, but our state is asking why we don't.
Well, we used to, and
we
Ruby
used
used to do it.
And
So,
I think it's coming back around to there's been a couple of pieces of legislation that have required them to get training. And I think it was assumed that it would fall under us, and it didn't because of funding issues. So I think they're looking at that more closely now. But they should theoretically be going through all the same training. You typically follow. Well, there's some regulations, state regulations. So there's certain criteria that there's state people going in and inspecting those residential treatment centers.
Okay.
Okay.
You want to mention something about trauma and classroom?
Oh, yeah. So a couple things, because we know that participants are coming with their own trauma from the very beginning. You start, and I apologize if you do this in this environment. So you do as I say, and not as I do. But from the very beginning, you want to set it up that we might be talking about some very difficult things today, and it might spring some emotions on you. So feel free to leave the room, to get up and get a cup of coffee, to do whatever you need to do to make yourself comfortable. So modeling that trauma, and then just in the way that, when people respond to questions, in a way that you're approaching them in a supportive and a strength-based manner, and you're not saying, oh no, that's completely wrong. You're so even if what they say is completely wrong, but strengths-based, but mostly supporting, giving them that permission to take care of themselves, to do some self-care. And if you're doing activities, particularly, we have them actually do the ACE study themselves, or the ACE questionnaire themselves in the training. So we set that up to say, this may be triggering for you, this may not be comfortable. If you don't want to fill this out, you don't have to. You will not be sharing the results with anyone. If you would rather, and we do that right before there's a break. So when you have those kind of emotional conversations, it's important to maybe plan those for right when you're having a break or towards the end of the day, so that if you see somebody that needs additional support, that you can provide that during the break. And always give them permission to participate or not, and just make sure that encourage self-care. So in
Okay. I'm sorry.
I'm trying hard.
Really quick, online course that is on self-injurious behaviors, self-harm in children and teens. Very difficult topic. Suicidal ideation, suicides among children, adolescents, eating disorders, and it's online. So the trainer, every like about 30 minutes or 45 minutes, she has a slide on the screen that looks like a thermometer, and the middle of the thermometer would be like just fine, you know, and then the upper thing would be cannot do it anymore, losing focus, I'm gonna lose it soon, or down would be just, you know, I'm so bored. And every 45 to 30 minutes, the attendees online can draw each one of them and where they are. So one of the things.
Okay, we have to be at the RTC at 2, so we have to leave.
No,
at
not to leave, you have to
2.
be there at 2:30, and it'll
2:30,
probably
2:30.
take you 20 minutes, because it's
Okay.
right down the freeway.
And it's 10 minutes after, 11 minutes after right now. So let's very quickly just kind of go over what's happening. And we need to look at transportation. Sally's coming back for
Well, I'm
transportation.
thinking, because she's not at the office, so she knows she's going to the RTC, so I assume she's on her way. She said she'd be here at 2?
Yes.
Good, we're good, okay.
Perfect. So we have 2 vehicles we know are going. Lynn is driving to the RTC and Sally. Is there anyone else driving to the RTC? Lana, are you driving to the RTC?
Yes, yeah.
Okay,
So
so
whoever wants to go with me.
So we'll have 3 vehicles. So right after lunch, we'll meet out front and make sure we get everybody in a vehicle. And then after the RTC, you're coming back to Judy's. We're looking, some of you have people delivering food. We'll look at eating about 6 p.m. tonight, between, right around that time. And then tomorrow, let's just look really quickly here. We're going to really work on applications tomorrow. And we're gonna drill down in that. So we will work hard and we'll be done around 3. And then what we're planning to do, for those of you who would like to, we're gonna take a side trip over to the Micro Center. We do need to know who would like to go so we can make sure we do the transportation. So can I just see people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, this is just about everybody. We're all, you're all, wait, before you go, I'm not done with this. We'll catch dinner after that, so that's gonna be long to the evening as well. Anything good that I didn't get? We should get?
Only that I suspect with as much food that's coming in, we may have enough dinner for tomorrow night also. In which case we'll either send it home with you or you can come back for another day.
Okay, so in having said that, let's give Sarah, Amanda, and again, just, ask questions until you can, so they won't get a chance to eat. You just ask their questions.
And we will type this up with requests. We'll type this up and put it in some sort of written form, and think about some other documents you might want and give you some flash drives.
Perfect.
Hopefully we can get that done. You're here till 3 tomorrow?
We're here till 3.
All right, so at some
But we
point.
can email stuff too.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah. I just gave them a bunch of flash
We can
drives.
give it back to you.